is rendering, and as soon as that does its thing, then we will start our webinar in earnest this end. I just need to catch it to hit mute, otherwise you get two of me, which is horrific. On YouTube now. There we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you very, very much for dialing back in again now to our third session for our Responsible Raw Materials online free conference. Some of you will have noticed that this afternoon's speakers have already been getting into the depths of conversation. So please feel free to jump on the bandwagon of the conversation we've been having. Thank you very much, Andy, for your commentary that's coming through on the chat function. As per usual, I'm going to give just a quick rundown in terms of housekeeping and how to use Zoom, etc. Obviously, I don't need to talk about fire alarms or anything like that, because I think everybody is fully responsible for themselves, no matter where they might be sitting. And then I'll give a quick summary with regards to what we heard this morning and then tee us up for this afternoon. With regards to these introductory sessions, you will note from the schedule or the agenda that these will begin to disappear, because actually we've had lots of lovely people asking for additional talks that we've been gently slotting into the agenda, haven't we, Rose? And so we've been losing all of our housekeeping space, but this is great because the purpose of this conference is for as many people as possible to share their perspectives, share their thoughts and their ideas with regards to how do we make the locating, the mining, the processing, the buying and the selling of all of our raw materials as responsible as possible. So also to start with, my name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. I got reminded to say that this morning because apparently I forgot to say that on the first day. I am originally a geologist. So yes, I grew up licking rocks. I spent the first bit of my career as an exploration geologist, and then I worked in sustainability and also on mine sites as well. And now I run a risk management consultancy called Satala, and we spend our lives putting together all of the different types of risks. So be they governance, be they environmental, social, technical, financial, etc., putting them together to try to ensure that organizations truly make the best decisions possible. So now that we've got a good quorum of you on our attendees list, lovely attendees, if this is your first Zoom webinar, which I suspect is probably not. I suspect you are all far better at Zoom than I am. However, you may have noticed that over the last 3 hours, Zoom has done an update. So yes, they have made certain aspects of Zoom a little bit more pleasurable to the eye, and they may indeed have moved things around. So be warned, you are in a new Zoom world. Key things for you to note, however, down at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there are 3 main buttons for you as attendees to play with. One of them says raise hand, and if you click on that, a little blue hand miraculously appears beside your name. And what that means is that Rose and myself, we know that you would like to make a point, or perhaps you've got a question, or perhaps you're having some difficulty. So just let us know if you need any help by raising your little blue hand. Secondly, you will have a chat button. So if you click on that, a little chat box will open up probably to the right-hand side of your screen. And you, again, will be able to take part in various conversations that may be going on in the chat channel. And you'll see that Michael Vitter and Andy, for example, have already been chatting away in this afternoon's session. So feel free to get involved with all of that. Finally, you will see that there is a Q&A button, or a questions and answers button. And if you click on that, another box will pop up, which you should be able to move around the screen in front of you. And this is the main forum through which you can ask questions to the speakers, either one of the speakers who happens to be talking at the current moment in time, or if you've got a more general question, feel free to ask that as well. What we will do is we will attempt to answer your questions as we go through the passage of this afternoon, either in verbal format, if we capture them in time, or in written format. So we'll be pushing our lovely speakers and panelists towards all of your lovely Q&As as we go through this afternoon. Now, as mentioned earlier, everything is being recorded today. It's also being streamed live on YouTube. So if you want to watch us in slightly distorted stereo, then yes, you can watch us both in Zoom and on YouTube. Also, if you have any friends or colleagues who haven't managed to sign up to the conference yet, note there are still spaces available if you want to take part via Zoom. But if you haven't managed to do that, then just push the URL for the YouTube across to your friends and family, and they will also be able to take part in today's, or this afternoon's, discussion, I should say. In terms of trying to find some more information, or where do you sign up for the conference? Obviously, all of you have managed to do this already. But if I just share my screen in front of me, so that's, you will see there, so that is the YouTube channel rolling. This is the web page. You guys have all managed to find that. This is the sign up for the conference. But key things that you are probably interested in, most likely the abstracts page. And if you go to here, if you select Tuesday afternoon, that then filters all of the lovely abstracts, and you'll be able to go down here and be able to pick out the abstracts of the people that you're about to hear speak. So, for example, the wonderful one and only Dan Smith is about to give his fantastic talk. So if we click on that, we can see a little bit more of the background to Dan as a whole, and also his fantastic credibility. Sorry, Dan, I should be calling you Professor, sir, shouldn't I? With regards to all of this. He's shaking his head. Oh, he's just being modest now. So this is a case here where you'll be able to see a bit of a biography of all of our fantastic speakers. And as well, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials. Also, with regards to here, you'll see that there is a donate button now. If you click on that, you'll go straight to the Virgin Money giving page, and you can see that we've had some incredibly generous donations that have come in over the course of today. So thank you very, very much to SRK for your 500 quid. So Jane, I'm sure that has everything to do with yourself. So thank you very much for that. There's been some incredibly generous donations that have been given over the course of the day, and all of these donations are going to charities that are either focused on COVID-19 or responsible raw materials as a whole. So please feel free to give us your voluntary donations, because of course the conference is free. I should also say thank you very, very much to some of our sponsors as well. So MDSG, and I know that Dan is closely involved in MDSG, and the London Metal Exchange for your kind contributions that are helping us to run this conference this week as well. Final things to mention with regards to what is on the website, and all of this will gently be changing as we go through the week. But if you go to more, you will see that there is a learning materials button that you can click on there. And what we're beginning to put together on this page are some takeaway materials for you. And so they include everything from some university style questions, because we know that there are some teachers and some lecturers who are online, and perhaps some students as well who are wanting to use some of the material that is being recorded during the course of this week. And so you can run classes, you can use this for education's sake. Feel free to challenge all of the opinions and the comments that you hear during the course of this week. We've also got links across to different materials that are freely available online, such as the Geological Society, the World Barometer, etc. So from the Raw Materials Observatory, more of which you'll hear about today. If we are missing something here, please let us know. This is designed to be a repository for lots of information that people can go to and use going forwards. So the purpose of this week is not just for us all to have a delightful time listening to one another and challenging one another on our thoughts. It's also to create an online library of a whole load of information that we can then make use of going into the future. Rose, before I go for a little summary of this morning, is there anything else I need to say with regards to housekeeping?
No, I don't think so. If you're watching on YouTube, then we are keeping an eye on the comments there. So be nice there as well. And I've also got an eye on the Twitter, so feel free to tweet us as well and tag us on LinkedIn and stuff, and try and get the conversation going everywhere.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rose. And actually, just with regards to LinkedIn, you may have seen that from the session that we had yesterday, Kieran wrote, who was sitting in the background, desperately scribbling away. He wrote a fantastic blog article which summarized the session from yesterday afternoon. Ludovine has been beavering away since this morning and writing a blog article from this morning, capturing all of the salient points that were mentioned. And Alana, do you want to give us a wave? Yep, so that's Alana there. Alana will be doing the same for this afternoon. So thank you very, very much to all of our blog writers. Thank you also as well to all of our wonderful speakers in advance of your phenomenal talks. And a massive thank you as well to Rose, because it's Rose who's done most of the organisation of this conference that we have brought together over the course of the last 2 weeks. And yes, Rose, you can take that as a compliment. Well done. Okay, cool. So with regards to this afternoon, but just to build on what we heard this morning. So this morning we kicked off with a fantastic talk by Teresa Steele-Schober, who introduced us to some of the resource and reserve requirements. So resource and reserve, that's basically the amount of rock that we can actually take out of the ground. And there's a whole load of governance gets wrapped up in this. And Teresa is an expert in this, and especially with regards to the different governance that is used in South Africa. And the South African governance is special because they've been incorporating in environment, social and governance requirements into those reporting requirements for a little while now, or certainly they're ahead of the game with regards to the rest of the world. So Teresa shared some learnings with regards to that this morning, which was a great start to the day. We then heard from Nick Billam, and Nick shared with us some of his thoughts with regards to responsible sourcing, and especially with regards to the circular economy and the complexity with regards to the flow of raw materials. So coming out of the ground and then going into different products, be they mobile phones, cars, buildings, etc., and how much of those can we actually recycle, for example, as a whole, along with a whole plethora of other really useful information came through from Nick. We then went to Denmark and we went to the world of oil and gas, and Dr. Graham Smith shared with us some of the learnings that the oil and gas sector, or should I call them the energy sector, because of course there is a bit of a rebrand that's going on there at the moment. What do they do with regards to ascertaining how much is in the ground and how much of it can you actually pull out of the ground? And he really brought home the world of complexity and how difficult it is to try and ascertain the level of uncertainty with some of these different aspects, especially with regards to, say, the social and the environmental space. So that was really interesting to hear and learn from a different sector. We then went back to South Africa, and Ralton, who is an expert, especially with regards to mine closure, shared with us some really interesting facts and figures and ideas, especially with regards to the demolition paradox. And that's all around, at the end of the life of a mine, you're probably left with a whole load of infrastructure. And the question with regards to should that infrastructure be left for the local community to make use of, or actually are you burdening that local community with infrastructure and assets that actually cost a huge amount of money to maintain, and so actually you might be doing everybody a favor by demolishing them rather than leaving them there for future use. So this is really taking a good hard look at what should you be leaving behind when you finish mining a particular asset. We then went to Catherine, and Catherine brought home many different aspects around the social aspects of how do we treat people round about our mines, how do we build trust with those different communities around those different assets. And this is incredibly difficult. And she shared some really good examples of actually where this is incredibly difficult. And we had some really good commentary coming in through some of the different channels with regards to all of that, which teed up David, who gave us the case study of mining different commodities in Afghanistan, also known as very high risk territory. So how do you do it? What kind of risks might you face? Should you stay or should you go? i.e. do you run away from the potential opportunity of mining some commodities in Afghanistan, or by you trying to do this responsibly, actually is there a net benefit for that region of the world? So what do you do with regards to that? Then we came back to the UK, and David Payne gave us an insight to the UK mineral strategy. And this actually spurred a really interesting conversation about what is this UK mineral strategy, because it's primarily around those building materials. So forgive me, David, if I am misconstruing your talk in your papers here, but it's mostly around those construction materials, and do we have enough of them here in the UK for our needs as a whole, which was really interesting because many people who were listening at that point in time of the conference perhaps were coming at this more from a large-scale mining space, where a lot of the language that David was using perhaps means something slightly different, that really brought home the fact that we really need to listen to one another and understand what we're trying to say, especially when we're trying to build that trust and that respect between different members of the stakeholder community around responsible raw materials. And finally, we finished off this morning with a wonderful Ore Deposits Hub, where Alana was one of our 3 speakers, where they gave us the case study, really, of how we can come together as communities in this online world, and how we can break down those silos and those barriers that are often imposed on us from a geographical stance, and sometimes from a monetary stance as well, in terms of if we are able to afford to go to conferences, which is the traditional space, of course, to share all of our thoughts and our ideas. So that was this morning. And this morning was brilliant. This afternoon is going to be, as I said this morning, just as brilliant, because we've got another array of speakers for you who I'm really, really excited to hear from. And so just to give you a quick rundown of who we are looking forward to this afternoon. So we're going to start off with the wonderful Dan Smith, who is going to give us a discussion with regards to byproducts from ores and mine waste. And you will have seen from the chat and also from some of the conversation that was going on just prior to the start of the conference this afternoon, that this is a really, really pertinent area. So how do we make best use of all of that lovely material that comes out of the ground? We're then going to shift gears slightly, and we're going to go across to Jane, who's going to go and take a look at the neglected subject of compliance. Now, for some people might think that this is going to be deadly dull. It's not. Jane is absolutely fantastic. We heard quite a lot around governance yesterday, and so today we're going to hear a bit more about the compliance side of all of that. So what does this all mean? And Jane is a true expert in this space and is going to make it absolutely fascinating, aren't you, Jane? Yes, she's smiling. Great. She says, I hope so. Then we're going to go to the wonderful Tom, and Tom is going to give us an insight into mineral resource data and the United Nations classification framework with regards to sustainability reporting. And so we're going to go back to those rocks again, and Tom is going to give us insight to that, which is going to be great. Then we're going to go to Vita, and Vita kicks off actually a slightly literature heavy or analogy heavy with regards to the different titles of our talks, because we're going to go to responsible sourcing and the Anna Karenina principle. So Vita, I'm looking forward to this one, because you then flow very nicely into Sarah Caven, who's going to talk about A Tale of Two Minds. Ha ha. Thank you very much for that title, Sarah, who's going to be looking at both the artisanal and the small scale mining, junior explorers and geologists. So where is the opportunity for business model innovation with regards to this space as a whole, which is going to be brilliant. We're then going to go to Frederick, who's going to talk about COVID-19 mitigation. Yes, we've managed to get all the way through this conference so far without a title that includes COVID-19 in it. But Frederick, don't worry, we will embrace you in an isolated manner. And so Frederick's going to talk to us about COVID-19 mitigation for miners and mining communities as a whole. So that's something that many people on the call will be thinking about at this precise moment in time. We then go to the wonderful Cat Bruce, and we hear about environmental DNA accelerates the power and pace of biodiversity surveys for environmental impact assessments. And if it feels like 5:20 in the evening UK time is late to listen to a talk, I seriously encourage you to stick around for Kat, because she's got some seriously awesome technology and really exciting ways with which we can define and monitor our biodiversity around some of those raw materials mining operations that we have as a whole. And finally, we're going to finish off in the project space, and we're going to go to Vancouver Island, where Craig Rice is going to talk to us about project management, and that will finish off with a bit of a panel session. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm going to gently pass across to the wonderful Dan Smith, who will gently find his unmute button and begin to share his slides, so that Dan can begin to share with us his thoughts, his feelings, and his ideas with regards to byproducts from ores and mine waste. So put your virtual hands together behind your mutes for Dan and his talk. Thank you very much.
Hopefully I've hit all the buttons properly, so if I can have some nods that everyone can hear me. So I'm going to be talking today about byproducts from ores and mine waste, and I'm going to use a lesser known semi-metal called tellurium as a case study, and this stems from a project that we had at the University of Leicester with a number of other partners in our consortium, a NERC sponsored project on tellurium and selenium. So I'm happy to discuss other elements. So Sarah's already dropped me in it by mentioning cobalt, but my talk is going to really concentrate on tellurium as a case study, and it shows some of the problems around byproducts quite neatly. I note already in the questions and answers and in the chat there are comments coming through about surely we have a moral obligation to be more resource efficient or intensive, and to extract as much metal from every unit of ore as we possibly can, and that includes the byproducts. And I'm going to go through why we often don't, in fact. So what are the byproducts? Well, the short definition, they often don't necessarily have a rigorous definition that transcends all resource codes. But in common language, they are metals that are produced incidentally to the main target of a mine or a mineral processing facility. And in fact, a lot of our byproducts are not tracked at the mine stage. They appear at smelters, refiners, or in downstream producers that are reprocessing wastes, residues, slimes, slags, etc. from earlier in the mineral processing facilities. From a geological or a mineralogical perspective, they will either occur as small amounts of exotic minerals in much more abundant mineral streams, or as trace elements within more common minerals. So for example, a lot of the sites that we look at, pyrite is actually quite rich in a range of metals which can have some economic or environmental or social value. So technology metals within pyrite, for example, and the pyrite is very abundant. It's just that the absolute concentrations of those elements within pyrite are often quite small, and therefore make it challenging to process and recover those metals. They might be extracted by the main operator of a mine and plant, and where mines are vertically integrated, in other words, the mine and the smelter are operated by the same company, that becomes more likely. In many cases, however, mines actually don't produce metals. What they actually do is they export a concentrate, and quite often that concentrate will be processed and byproducts might be extracted from it, but those profits and those revenues will not be passed on to the company that originally mined that unit of metal. In fact, in some cases, they are charged for metals that are recovered and later sold as byproducts, as elements that are deleterious to the mineral metallurgical processing, or as elements that, if released into the environment, can have ecotoxicological effects. Quite often, this is why there is a really fragmented market with lots of different small companies involved in it, because companies are selling on wastes and residues as assets that other people can extract value from, so they can reduce their own liabilities and their own wastes. Very often, the byproducts are not included in resource and reserve estimates. So when you look at a project at feasibility stage, or in terms of annual returns for a company, quite often they will not include the byproducts within that. So they're not necessarily considered to be the payable metals within a mine or a mineral extraction system. And we contrast that with the co-products. So for example, molybdenum is a common co-product of porphyry copper deposits, as is gold, whereas tellurium is often not listed at all, even though it's a very common byproduct from copper processing. So our byproduct, as we can see in the figure below, which was put together by my colleague, Professor Gowan Jenkin, quite often our mines produce a lot of product and waste, and there is a very small amount of byproduct that accompanies that concentrate, and that value from that product, byproduct specifically, might be recovered by the refiner, but is never even noticed by the producer. And in some cases, the producer, the original miner, might not even be characterizing the ore for its contents. So sometimes we use a multi-element assay or a multi-element data set to characterize the ore at exploration stage, but by the time we're through to metallurgy, we might be simply looking at a very single element assay, for example, for gold. And so we actually lose a lot of data on where our byproducts are within a metal system. So a couple of quick diagrams just to show you some byproduct relationships. Most of the world's mining is factored around a very small number of major metals: iron, aluminium, copper, lead, zinc, nickel, for example. And with them, there are a series of metals which are commonly recovered as co-products. So I'm going to focus on the copper route today, and later start discussing gold. So as a byproduct from a co-product, I should say, from copper, we often see lead, zinc, silver, gold, and molybdenum, and then there are a series of byproducts. So sometimes these have got a very strong geochemical affinity for each other. So in our copper sector of the Reuter wheel here, those associations are largely because those elements are chalcophile. They behave like metals that love to bond to sulfur, or they replace sulfur in similar minerals. In some cases, byproduct recovery is dictated by metallurgical processes rather than the fundamental geology and mineralogy, and it's just when that element is cost effective to recover at some point in the processing cycle. We can look at this in a periodic table perspective. The angry colors represent, or the hot colors represent where an element or a metal or a semi-metal, in the case of some of them, has a high degree of what the USGS referred to as companionity. Can I say it? It's what percentage of it is recovered as a byproduct associated with another metal rather than mined and processed on its own merits. So the red colors you can see here are the ones that are frequently or exclusively recovered as byproducts. Just to make that a little bit smaller, you can see the figure on the right is Gavin Mudd's version of what constitutes a critical metal in his paper where he discussed byproducts as well. And you can see there's a pretty strong overlap between where the colors are hot in critical assessments, they're also hot in byproduct assessments. So although we can recover byproducts from a range of more stable metal processing routes, actually it's not really giving us the confidence in supply that we need in the future. In other words, our supply of byproducts remains quite vulnerable. The reasons for this are because they don't have any influence over the mining itself, and they actually don't contribute very much to the overall value of the ore. There are very few drivers to ensure and secure their supply. So byproduct recovery is very important, but it's actually not something that the industry has much control over. So I'm going to focus on tellurium. You'll notice that it's in the red section in terms of byproduct association. So about 90% of it is recovered from reprocessing of streams from copper residues, particularly the disgustingly named anode slimes from metal processing. And you'll notice that it's a glorious white color in the criticality assessment. And that's because a few years ago, tellurium moved into a period of oversupply based on how much was coming out of the copper industry versus how much different consumers were buying. Again, that's because the market doesn't really respond very well to supply and demand for these byproduct metals. So it would be nice if it was still critical. It would keep me in research money for a few more years. So what do we use tellurium for? Well, about 40% of its use and most of the growth in the past few decades has actually been for thin film solar, and about 30% of it are for thermoelectric devices, bismuth telluride thermoelectric devices used for turning waste heat into energy, or for turning energy into heating and solid state cooling. These uses are important in the future. Between now and 2050 in particular, a lot of the world's governments, including the UK, are making serious commitments to decarbonising their economy, their industry, their entire infrastructure. So we will need more of rare metals like tellurium that underpin technologies which are important for those low carbon energy generation and energy efficiency. Despite the growth in demand for tellurium over recent decades, driven almost exclusively by solar power, the amount of tellurium that we recover per unit of copper has actually dropped remarkably since the 60s. There's a bit of a bald spot in the data in recent decades, but I can tell you from slightly more illicit data that I've not put in this talk, that the situation has carried on the trend that we see, that there's been a systematic drop in what we would call the byproduct intensity of tellurium recovery from copper. Why is that? I should go back a slide first. That's simply because we've found new methods, or new since the 60s, of processing copper ore that are bulk tonnage, heap leach type processes that don't allow us to recover tellurium. They basically don't produce the right waste streams that the companies that extract tellurium can process. So we found new ways of mining the copper at the expense of the byproducts. This is why many byproducts become critical. Their supply is subject to changes in supply, demand, and technological innovation, which are outside of their own market. So recovering byproducts, why should we do it? I think we can all agree there is a moral case for doing it, but let's unpack that. So we've talked about, do we reduce the waste if we recover byproducts? And basically, no, you don't. So a typical copper deposit might run, if you're very lucky, at about 1% copper for a big porphyry deposit. So if it runs at 1% copper, and people will tear me to pieces over this gross simplification, but if you run at 1% copper, you are running at 99% waste. That means if you've got 1 billion tons of copper ore, you've got, near as damn it, 1 billion tons of waste. And your tellurium in a 1% copper ore is probably running at 1 ppm if you are lucky. So if you extracted the tellurium from your waste, you would make a tiny, tiny impact on the total amount of waste that we are talking about. Admittedly, you are removing something that could have potentially serious consequences in the environment, but at 1 ppm, it's not actually registered or recognized as having an ecotoxicological effect. It's only going to be seriously considered an environmental problem when it's concentrated up into the anode slimes. So in terms of the environmental footprint of byproducts, we're not really reducing waste. There is another environmental benefit that I'll touch on later. Does it make us money? Where's the profit in this? Let's take a cynical view of the mining industry, that they're in it just for the money. Does it make money? Well, this graph is going to start to give you a warning sign for tellurium at least. So you can see that it has, let me see if I can you see my mouse? You can see my mouse. So you can see tellurium down here as a crustal abundance, which is somewhere between gold and silver, a little bit closer to gold. But its price is orders of magnitude lower. This means that, in fact, you can't make much money off recovering tellurium, because although it has a higher value than, for example, copper, there is a tiny amount of it in any ore. Certainly compared to gold. So it means most of our systems will be optimized for recovering these high value rare metals up here, our precious metals. And in fact, that's what we see. When we look at anode slimes, we can see a diverse range of metals in here. I won't bother listing these, but this is where most of, or a lot of, our byproduct potential from copper ore comes, is from this processing step. And the tellurium is part and parcel of some of these. You can see this dark gray box here represents our tellurium for a number of them. But when we turn this into the value that we can recover, in fact, the value is coming from silver and gold. And most anode slime reprocessing is done not for the specialty metals, but for those precious metals. And it just so turns out that when you recover the gold and silver, you're basically obliged to recover tellurium and selenium too, because they're bonded to the gold and the silver. That's just a quirk of metallurgy in the periodic table, that you've got to get one out when you get the other. But in terms of making you money, it's not the tellurium that's really doing it for these companies. So the byproduct recovery for copper is not technically favorable, particularly when we've seen the growth of heat leaching operations for oxidized or for low grade ore. So we don't have a good scenario in the future for increasing tellurium from copper production. So what we've been looking at in our project, and we're not alone in doing this as academics, and certainly the industrial sector has been looking at it too, is looking at recovering tellurium from gold. So in the 80s and the 70s, there was a period where a number of gold deposits had tellurium extracted from them before anode slime processing basically dominated the market. And at present, there's only one mine in the world which has a reserve of tellurium, and that's Kankberg in Sweden, which is a gold telluride mine. And there are a number of exploration projects which are actually starting to market gold telluride deposits on the basis of their tellurium content and the fact that they could provide a metal necessary for environmental applications. The question is that greenwashing? So I'm going to explore that cynical argument now. And the short answer is, basically, it is a little bit of a greenwash to argue that your tellurium is an important part of a mine. In terms of the profit, you've got to have a huge ratio of tellurium to gold in order for it to affect the bottom line. So the companies that are marketing tellurium first, really, they're going to make most of their money out of gold. But the question is that greenwashing really? And I would say not really, because the critical metals agenda that's been dominating certainly political and academic discussions around economic geology for the last couple of decades, that critical metals agenda has driven a huge amount of exploration and speculation and prospecting. And now we're starting to see mining activity too, to deliver those metals to the industries and the consumers that are demanding them, and to break some of that byproduct risk association. And we have seen, I'm not going to name any of the companies here, but some tellurium consumers have been linked to becoming vertically integrated companies, essentially tellurium consumers buying into and opening their own mines to directly mine tellurium to make sure they have the supply they need over the future years. So these green gold mines, as I'm referring to them, so gold mining operations, which are now starting to flag up their byproducts as a more important constituent than they ever really will be from an economic perspective, they are actually a real positive, because they are allowing us as a society to avoid the need of opening tellurium mines and directly mining byproducts. So the environmental impact here is not that these are green mines, it's that they are avoiding new mines which are essentially unnecessary elsewhere. And in the case of some of these companies, the tellurium, I'm not naming them in this presentation, by the way, but you can go out and Google them for yourselves. Tellurium is not a route to significant profit. It's a relatively low value metalloid, particularly given its crustal abundance. But what we're seeing is that perhaps a new route for financing where byproduct metals have a demand and there is a need for security of supply for those byproducts. So things like financing agreements, partnerships at exploration and mining and capital investment stages, offtake agreements, etc., are providing a route to finance for companies that are dealing with otherwise metallurgically complex deposits. So we're perhaps seeing a reinvigoration of byproducts and perhaps not seeing them marketed as byproducts, but as primary products. But overall, we need to look at the benefits that it's allowing us to de-risk some of the product supply of these critical metals that we society really wants and needs. So to come back to responsible reserves, we have a real challenge in the future with byproducts, and maybe Tom will touch on this when he deals with some of his data. With the byproducts, we deal with a very data poor and very fragmented market. There are no reserves and resources, or very few reserves and resources, that explicitly list these elements that we're interested in. There's a question about how we define the payable metals in an ore. So in a resource code, how do we actually oblige companies and exploration companies, mining companies, etc., to disclose their contents or even measure the contents of some of these metals in their ore? Because for many of those companies, they are not payable, and they are worth fractions of a cent in the dollar of revenue that they would make from the major metals. Should we oblige them to require to disclose potentially payable metals, or to release exploration data sets? Those are difficult questions when, particularly in the exploration sector, it's data that is the commodity that they produce rather than the metals. But some of this might be sidestepped by green finance, and essentially a soft vertical integration of consumers of rare metals directly sponsoring mining activities in order to get the resources they want and need with companies that they trust from a very streamlined market, essentially. And that's me. So I'll take some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Stan. That was absolutely fantastic. Now, there are a couple of questions that have come in online. Just with regards to timing, I'm going to ask you for a very swift answer to Andy Smith's question, which is around how do you value the byproduct co-products in terms of supporting the primary extractive product? Are there any models that can be applied?
I don't know of any off the top of my head. Most of the time when we've spoken with the mining companies, they've sat down and done a swift back of the envelope calculation to work out what the revenue would be. So not even factoring in the cost of recovery. And because of the abundances and the prices of some of the byproducts, usually those revenues are actually quite small compared to the primary products. And with the mining industry, because a lot of it is done as publicly traded companies, they've got to appease investors. And what we find is that to argue that they should put research and innovation and research and development into recovering a new metal that would recover fractions of a cent on the dollar profit or revenue even, they won't be able to make that argument. They could invest that same amount of R&D into just incrementally improving their major metal recovery, and that would have a much bigger impact on their economics. Essentially, the economic argument for a mining company to recover byproducts is usually not very strong.
Brilliant.
Otherwise, they would do it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much, Dan. I point you to some of the other questions that are coming through on chat, which includes a couple, or at least one, from a certain Richard Harrington, who, if anybody wants to hear about cobalts, then he will be giving a talk later on this week. So go and find that. So brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Dan. Now we're going to shift gear into that wonderful world of exciting compliance. So Jane, we're going to come across to yourself now. And Jane is, as you will see, from SRK and has huge experience working across the world on a multitude of different operations as a whole. So without further ado, Jane, across to yourself. I think you might be on mute at the moment.
Sorry about that. The compliance obligations that I'm going to be talking about are approval and permit conditions, terms and conditions of agreements and commitments made by stakeholders. They're legally binding obligations. I'm not going to be talking about voluntary commitments made in corporate policies, for example. Oh, I'm struggling to advance my presentation here. Oh, there we are. These compliance obligations are usually site-specific, and they're usually made through legal processes such as environmental and social impact assessment processes and approval processes. other permitting processes, through negotiation of agreements, and they generally reach through extensive stakeholder engagement. Who are the parties who neglect compliance? They're listed here. Many, but not all, definitely not all. In my opinion, the main reason why compliance obligations are neglected is a genuine lack of awareness that the obligations are being created in those processes that I mentioned earlier. And also, over the last couple of decades, there hasn't been huge pressure to achieve compliance. Mines only get in trouble if they're in conflict with government or there's a big incident. I can think of a mine that I looked at fairly recently that has been operational for 20 years, and in the early stages of permitting that mine, they committed to line their tailings facilities, and that never happened, and nobody was ever really aware that the commitment existed until more recent times. Now, that loss of institutional memory that you see at mines arises because a lot of the people who are involved in permitting don't continue into the construction phase and into the operational phase. Also, mines may have selective or partial compliance. They will be focusing on some permits and not realizing that they have compliance obligations in a number of other documents. Environmental and social consultants like me even can neglect compliance. We know very well that these commitments are being created in processes, but sometimes when we review operations, we don't have the budget to look at compliance, and we can't do it properly unless a mine has a compliance obligation register. It takes quite a bit of time. There are so many compliance obligations, you can't comprehend those quickly. Regulatory authorities inspect mines frequently, but they often don't look at compliance properly. They will focus in on particular areas of interest, and in different jurisdictions they have got favorite subjects that they look at, and mines will report to regulatory authorities on compliance. They're supposed to. There'll be annual reporting, quarterly reporting, even monthly reporting. But the mines in those reports, even though they're submitting to the regulatory authorities, are not specifically talking about their compliance obligations. In fact, they'll present monitoring data and they will present information of interest to the regulatory authorities, but not specifically cover compliance. In the last 2 decades, there's been an explosion of ESG standards that mines have to observe, particularly in recent years. And these can sometimes distract from compliance obligations. Many do require observation of legal requirements of compliance obligations, but they do distract. One example is GRI reporting. Sometimes there's such a focus on metrics and the reporting is very much at a corporate level, and site-specific issues are neglected. Also, the IFC performance standards, those are very well-known standards. I respect them very much, but the way they're implemented can be a problem. And I've seen this problem in Africa, I've seen this problem in Europe, I've seen this problem in countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Basically, what happens is lenders require that an additional environmental impact assessment process is taken. That's in parallel or after a government environmental impact assessment process. And what happens sometimes is that process is conducted completely independently of the regulatory process. So agreements that have been negotiated, commitments that have been made, don't come into the management plans that are done for lenders. And so you'll have these mines with a whole set of management plans produced for lenders and different plans produced for regulatory authorities. I worked with a mine that had an incident a little while ago, and they had a great deal of difficulty explaining to the regulatory authorities that they were working to completely different plans, that they had completely different from the plans they had agreed with the regulatory authorities. This slide, it is quite a complicated slide, but it's showing the pressures on projects and operations. There's really only one point I want to make with this slide, but the purple is showing the legal side. There is international law gets transposed into national legislation, and then the legislation gets translated into compliance obligations through permitting processes. And that's the purple. The blue is showing corporate requirements that are imposed on projects, and the green requirements imposed by financial institutions. The main point I want to make on this slide is that these all have common origins. They are actually all influenced by international initiatives, and similar principles are being implemented through all these routes. This slide, I want to make the point that, and if I drew the scale, I would draw it even more unbalanced. I just borrowed an image that most of the compliance obligations that mines have are environmental and social governance obligations. Mines have a huge number of environmental and social governance obligations. This slide is illustrating specifically mining law. It's not illustrating other law. And it's actually illustrating mining codes in West Africa, which are quite modern. In many West African countries, they follow a similar model with their mining codes. So the mining codes require that environmental law is respected. You can't get mining approvals without environmental approvals being in place in the first place. They require respectful law on land tenure and human rights. They require respectful labor law, and they require respectful tax law. But they also have special requirements about addressing poverty, value creation, shared value, not destroying value. They require local employment, local procurement, providing training and contributing to research, contributing to community development, participating in extractive industry transparency initiatives, and planning and providing for closure. That might be interesting for people who don't work in Africa, realizing that the mining law has got many ESG requirements embedded in the law. This slide, I'm showing that compliance obligations that mines typically have, and as I go through it, I'll give you an idea of the number of obligations that you will typically find. So in a mining permit, you would typically find 10 to 20 environmental and social governance obligations. In a minerals agreement, a modern minerals agreement, you would also find about 20 requirements which link directly to the legislation. So these items that I showed you earlier, it will be more specific in the minerals agreement. So the minerals agreement might say 90% of your workforce must be local. So it will give a number for the requirement. In Europe, you don't have minerals agreements, you'll have planning agreements instead, and those will have many terms and conditions in them as well. Environmental authorizations generally have more than 30 requirements in, and then all the other environmental permits that have to be obtained will also have 10 to 30 requirements in them. In the green, the legally binding management plans that are submitted as part of the permitting processes often contain hundreds of commitments in them. And that's where people don't realize, those are the compliance obligations that sometimes get lost. People don't realize that those have become binding in the permitting processes. So they include mine waste management plans, biodiversity action plans, and closure plans. Then the commitments in resettlement plans, community development agreements, and the lenders' environmental and social action plans, which are produced at the end of a due diligence before financing a project. Those are generally very neat and usually only have 10 or 20 well-stated commitments. All the commitments I've talked about now are generally site-specific, unique to the project in its setting. Customer agreements are being introduced through supplier codes of conduct now, and they are more generic. Mines that are performing well in terms of tracking their compliance obligations don't look like this. They don't look like they're drowning in their compliance obligations. What they do have is they don't just have a register of the legislation that's applicable. They'll have a full register of permits and agreements. They'll have a register of all their compliance obligations in those permits and agreements. They'll be tracking compliance with that. They'll be auditing it, and they will be reviewing where they're not complying and taking action to achieve compliance. Now, mines who are doing that realize that they have to look very carefully at the compliance obligations they make in the first place, because many mines find when they first look at the compliance obligations, they realize that they're very poorly worded and very difficult to follow. So if they've got experience and they're paying attention to this, when they're permitting, they will make sure that the commitments are sensible in their permitting processes and in the negotiation of their agreements. Right, it's the end.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jane. And you can hear in your imagination that applause has now been given to you from behind all of those muted microphones. So thank you so much for that, and that insight into the compliance aspect of what a mining company, for example, needs to be doing. So on that, we've got a number of questions that have come in here, and one comes from Michael, and he says, "Hi Jane, do you consider mapping compliance reporting and regulations into a hierarchy?" And this, he gives some more context to say that this is something that he did at Sustainalytics concerning the various tailings management and reporting standards. So that's the mapping of the compliance reporting and the regulations.
I don't perfectly understand what you're saying, but yes, I would imagine you need to map compliance reporting and regulations, link the two together.
Brilliant. So I think this is maybe something here, Michael, if you want to exacerbate on what or build on your question, feel free to do that in the Q&A, and then Jane will be able to maybe take this offline and be able to answer you a bit better. So this is a case here, Jane, I think, where Michael's asking about a hierarchy of importance. So what are the most important requirements, say, for example, within the compliance aspects that need to be addressed first?
Yes, I think that's very wise, that there is a hierarchy of importance and understanding of materiality and importance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. And another question here comes in from Teresa. And what she's asking, she's saying that your presentation clearly maps out the workload on the environment, social governance members of staff, or the departments on a mine site, who have to somehow also monitor and report on all of these compliance obligations, I suspect, as well as a load of other requirements that are coming in from different auditors, customers, etc. And what Teresa's saying is that there are, in her experience, very few mines who actually do this really well. And so the competence of the regulators, as well as the on-site practitioners, further impacts the ability of mines to do this well. So if you had to highlight one critical success factor to doing this well, what would you say it might be?
I think it's awareness and having sufficient budget. I absolutely agree with I think you said it was Teresa, I agree with everything she says there. I think it is awareness, and when mines are aware of how many compliance obligations they have, they realize that they have to allocate more time and budget to follow this properly. I think sometimes the resources aren't there to do the tracking track all these compliance obligations. I've seen mines with thousands of compliance obligations, not hundreds, thousands.
And that's something there where perhaps, Jane, yesterday we heard Ludovine giving a fantastic overview with regards to governance. And something that Ludovine said during that talk, and Ludovine, I know that you are here and listening, so please feel free to challenge me on my interpretation of what you said. Ludovine was talking about the culture that governance helps to create, and how perhaps that is sometimes one of the differentiators between governance and compliance. Would you agree with that? Or would you say actually often you may find a culture that is associated with the level or the importance that different companies put on compliance?
I don't think compliance and governance are different things. I think compliance is a fundamental part of a management system. Understanding all your obligations, all your commitments you've made to all the different parties is absolutely central to governance. And I can't see them separated at all. I may not have answered your question.
No, I think you have given us a very good opinion on this. And so maybe, for example, Ludovine and yourself would like to take this offline, although it may, of course, be my misinterpretation of all of this. And actually, Ludovine's just saying through on chat right now, she says she agrees they are parts of a whole. So therefore, they're different, but they're also part of the same organism, perhaps. So with that, Jane, thank you very, very much once again. And again, we are clapping wildly. There are some more questions for you on the Q&A. So if you'd like to be able to answer them offline, that would be absolutely brilliant. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to shift across to Tom. Tom, who is a member of the British Geological Survey. And Tom, if you'd like to unmute yourself and begin to share your slides, is going to share some insight with us with regards to the United Nations classification framework and sustainability reporting. So Tom, over to your wonderful self.
Oh yeah, so really, I mean, so I'm just going to talk about sort of resource data today, how the UNSC, United Nations framework classification fits into that, and sort of reporting on the sustainability aspects of resources. I mean, that all sounds, you know, like a lot of data, but what I'm really going to talk about today is something that Sarah touched upon when she introduced the session about how subtle changes in how we use words and definitions can actually have a big impact on how we communicate between sort of different areas. Yep. So resources and reserves are terms that those working in the field of economic minerals or commodities often hear, and these terms can have really very different meanings to different people. To some, it may represent really tightly defined legal terms. To others, really, you know, much more vague concepts. Kind of to explain, and this may sound like heresy to some, but to explain what I mean by this, it might help build a background from perhaps where I'm coming from on this particular issue. So I work for the British Geological Survey. Like many other national geological surveys around the world, we operate in a space between the minerals industry, national government and policymakers. Personally, I have very little experience in resource and reserve reporting for investors, sort of a company environment. That's not the kind of work we do. And this this talk's not going to focus on that kind of those aspects at all, really. Which I'm sure some of you will be very relieved you're here, because it's something I don't have much expertise on. I have, however, been involved in several projects in recent years where policymakers within the EU, from national governments, have wanted to know what our endowment is in minerals, and they've wanted to know this to help form industrial strategies and policies around extraction and production. And they've come to the BGS, they've come to geological surveys and research organisations to ask this, and these kind of questions, the kind of aspects this talk's going to focus on. So why do governments and institutions like the EU or the UN, for that matter, care about resources? You know, what is something that they're really focused on at the moment, which they are. So we already heard from Dan earlier today about critical metals and the rise of minor metals and anything from, you know, critical infrastructure to small household appliance has really raised concerns amongst many, you know, national and regional questions about, you know, security of supply being asked, where we're going to source our critical raw materials from. Is this something national government are this is something national governments are really concerned about. Can we source enough materials to serve our needs? Do we need to develop our own national inventories, for example? And it's also recognised we need to decarbonise. Now, a key part of this is reduced resources. How can we achieve this? Can we reduce the impact of mining through changing how we source minerals? What are the stocks available from prime extraction versus stocks for recycling, for example? We need to know these things. We need to know what the inputs, the primary inputs into tools used for environmental accounting, life cycle assessments, like material flow analysis. All these require resource data in some form. And more importantly, and perhaps the point of this whole talk, is what we really need is an understanding of what these terms mean, so the correct data are available and the correct questions can be asked of what this data can kind of deliver. So a little bit of history on resource and reserve data. Now, I'm sure many listening will be very familiar with this, but if you're not, a very, very brief introduction. So the first kind of moves to really officially define what was meant by the terms of resource and reserve was made by McKelvey, working for the USGS in the 1970s. And you can see kind of a very basic version up on my screen. This was built over the years. It wasn't until like in the mid-1990s until formal internationally recognized definitions were adopted by the minerals industry. The driver for this being several really big scandals which massively undermined confidence in investors in the mining sector. This kind of culminated in the brick scandal, the story of which is, there's a simplified version of the cover diagram there. And there's a nice picture of Matthew McConaughey there, starring in the film about bricks, which is a very good film for those who are interested in more detail in this. Anyway, since then, many national codes have been developed, which really tightly define what these terms mean. Many of these conform to internationally recognised standards, and these are administered by the Committee for Mineral Resources Internationally Reporting Standards, or CRISCO. Great. So as a result, there's very little confusion about what's meant by resources and reserves in the minerals industry using these definitions. However, there has been a great deal of confusion for those outside the minerals industry, amongst politicians and academics, to what these data are, what they physically represent, and what you can really do with them. And that's kind of caused problems. So despite numerous excellent articles explaining why this isn't correct, I still see things about how humanity's on the brink of running out of some key commodity or other. And I think my colleague Andrew Blugger is going to talk about this issue a lot more in detail in a talk later on this week. Now, we as geologists know that if you put enough money in your exploration budget, you probably find more mineral. We know grades of new discoveries are decreasing globally. However, technologies are constantly improving for extraction. New deposit models being developed and refined. And you can see from the panic of a rare earth a few years ago, this kind of really highlighted this, that if you actually look for more mineral, there's a lot of exploration was done, they found a huge amount more. The constraint in that instance wasn't lack of resources, in the Earth's crust. It was something completely different, which is certainly a topic for another presentation. So what are the major issues? Now, a good example of kind of what some of these are is seen from a project I worked for on Horizon 2020 project called Minerals for You a few years ago. It was asked, amongst other things, to build an inventory of European resources and reserves for a very wide range of commodities. Many in the European Commission considered this a really simple data gathering exercise to answer some important policy questions they had. However, despite months of really painful data collection, no inventory could be forthcoming. And there's two reasons for this. The first being quite simple. Around 20 different definitions of resources and reserves are being used across Europe, including many different individual national definitions that we use for national reporting. And these all measure really different things. If you think about that simple McKelvey box from earlier, these definitions of what a resource constituted fitted a different part of that box. So you couldn't, simply sum the data. And there's, a second problem, which is that although much of the data wasn't Crisco compliant figures, which is great, we know exactly what they are, we can compare and contrast those. These data have been specifically designed for the purpose of ensuring investor confidence. They're not real measures of physical stocks, they're economic entities. They constantly change with changing socioeconomic situations locally. So they kind of tell you what's available in maybe 5 or 10 years, but they're not really designed for long-term planning or these kind of national resource management or calculation of national inventories, which is the kind of data that I'm going to talk about here, the kind of that's been asked from national governments, the kind that's needed for undertaking long-term environmental assessments and comparisons. They don't include things like the sort of sub-economic undiscovered resources, which kind of fit in that bottom right-hand corner of that simplified McKelvey box. This kind of information isn't covered by Crisco. Now, this isn't in no way a criticism of this kind of scheme. It wasn't designed to do this. We're asking something it wasn't designed to do for. So we have an issue there. It kind of doesn't quite work for the purposes we're using it for. So one option perhaps is to use the United Nations Framework Classification. So this is something that I've been doing a lot of work recently with, and this is a classification that's been designed by the UN for trying to quantify in a comparable way different types of resources. And by doing this, we can, there's a huge scope, a huge flexibility to fit in different types of resource data. I haven't got the time today to kind of explain it all in detail, but basically you've got 3 axes, which are environmental, socio-economic viability, technical feasibility, and degree of confidence. That degree of confidence used to be geological knowledge. It's just recently been changed. But sort of to explain that makes it a bit more understandable, kind of what that means. So you can look at that in 2 dimensions. Oops, sorry, I've gone forward a few slides there. So you can look at that in 2 dimensions, which perhaps a little simpler. So you can kind of see the common stages of the life cycle of mineral projects and kind of where they equate to that kind of UNFC matrix. So you can see one of the main strengths of it is that it's possible that all those different definitions, the different areas of that McKelvey box, anything from what's in operating projects to theoretical models of what's maybe in the Earth's crust at kind of continental scales, can be fitted somewhere within UNFC. And this flexibility makes it very attractive to organisations such as geological surveys, who hold very large amounts of data, often historical data, various vintages, which is really important, valuable on a kind of national level. We can't define that in a kind of Crisco context. So, it's really useful to be able to define that in a consistent way using schemes and tools like UNFC. Something else the new version of UNFC also includes is a real clear linking to the SDGs in the environmental and socio-economic viability axes, and that's makes it very strong on kind of reporting on this level. So this kind of knowledge, so using definitions that incorporate all these different possible types of resource data can really help us to identify data gaps as well, so we kind of know where this data might be missing. So it's important, so this is really important. So when, let's say, and this is a real example, the EU may say, well, how much copper do we have in Europe? We need to know how much copper we have in Europe. We can now demonstrate, if not actually necessarily provide data for, how there may be a certain amount available in current mines, we can quantify that, but how actually there might be a vast amount more, if required, of resource, if the socio-economic conditions were different within the Earth's crust. And Dan set me up a bit here earlier with his comment about tellurium and byproducts. A lack of data does not represent a lack of resources. So and this is a really important point. That example from tellurium earlier, if you did a study of how much tellurium resource you have on the planet, obviously there's only one mine that reports that. So, you know, that number in its own would be meaningless. You need to take into account when you're using that number, the way that the minerals, the complex way that the minerals industry works, various economic factors, and how this kind of integrates with how this data is kind of presented, which is a really complex thing to try and explain to a policymaker who just wants a simple number they can base something on, you know, which is really hard to do. You know, and this is why tools like UNSC become quite important here. I haven't really got time in detail to talk about many issues around things like the nightmare that is byproduct reporting, but if you're interested, I can send you some reports later if you get in touch with me. Going back to the more sustainability side of things, this kind of knowledge is also really important as an input when undertaking exercise such as life cycle analysis or materials flow assessments. Without understanding of what stocks are available over different timescales, it's really hard to actually model kind of what's going to happen down the line. So you need to understand what you're going to start off with before you can really understand what you're going to end up with. Also, a better understanding where resources are. We may be able to source minerals close to home with better environmental standards, less transport distances, you know, integrate kind of mines with other heavy industry, much more strategic planning, things like that. So I'm just going to quickly sum up. So if we want to plan for least environmental damaging forms of extraction, we really need a good understanding of stocks. Classifications like the UNSC are a really good way of doing this, but of course, definition standards will only get us so far. What this really hinges on ultimately is work on exploration, work on development of minerals data that we already have by re-evaluating historic data in a modern context. You know, this sort of research is really key to understand what we have and what we have in terms of these sort of critical metals and these tricky issues around byproducts and things like that. But of course, I would say that as a geologist. So that's it for my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Tom. As per usual, you can imagine that fantastic applause that is ringing out on the other side of those muted microphones. So thank you very much for that. I think your talk is actually very well timed, because we have been hearing over the course of the session yesterday and this morning some really good insight into some of those codes of reporting. So, for example, Teresa spoke about the South African code, so SAMREC, this morning. And I know that we've got a range of different people from, say, for example, the European code, so that's PERC. I should just point out as well, I know that there are lots of people online who will not have a clue what we mean by this Crisco and PERC and all of this gobbledygook. What Rose and I will attempt to do, and everybody else, please feel free to weigh in here, is actually try and define what on earth we mean by these weird words that we're using here. With this, Tom, I've got a question here that's come in from Teresa and then built on by Richard. So if I may, one of the challenges with any framework that talks to feasibility and degrees of confidence is going to be subjective, depending on who is the person who's actually doing the assessment. And with that, feasibility for a small or a junior company is not going to be that as for the same for a multinational mining company. So taking this, to what extent does the UNFC address the range of assumptions that can go into assessments undertaken by those different companies?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say this as not a UNSC practitioner. I'm not heavily involved, but I am someone who's been sort of trying to develop training materials and things to help its use in recent projects. So you're right. I think it is subjective, and you know, this is very difficult. And something I've been trying to do is provide examples from lots of different case studies. And there's another Horizon 2020 project which is also trying to do this. GeoEra, there's a GeoEra project trying to do this at the moment, trying to provide case studies to kind of show, you know, how we can classify things in UNFC. Because UNFC, you know, it has been around for a while, but it's still quite new in terms of being developed, and there's still a lot of questions to be asked. However, I think saying that, I think any resource code or classification is also subjective. If you delve it, I think into the detail of Perk or JORC or anything like that, I think that when you get into the real nitty gritty of it, you always have to make subjective decisions based on geological. Well, I would say geological expertise, but in terms of the expertise of whatever aspect you're looking at, be that the kind of sustainability aspect, the geological aspect, or whatever. So and that's where it all comes. There's no easy fix. I think UNSC code is a very useful tool, but it still has to be used by experts in whatever field, the geology or the environmental side of things. So you still need that kind of expert person thing. And I think with regard to UNSC, that kind of, it's still the questions are being asked about kind of how the expert person role, kind of competent person really fits into that. But, I think that's the key there. It still has to be done by experts, and they have to make those subjective decisions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom. And what you will see when you come out of your talk just now is you'll see a stream of questions beginning to flow in for you. So if you want to start addressing those.
Let's take one comment. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm just seeing some of those. And I wanted to stress as well in some of the comments. I mean, in no way suggesting UNSC or Crisco are in any way in competition. They are two completely different ways of quantifying things that are used, I think, in very different settings. And I think that's a key point. They're in no way, competing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much for that, Tom. And again, just to take a massive step back. So all of this stuff about Crisco, UNFC, PERC, SAMRAC, SAMESC, etc., is all about how much of this is actually in the ground that we can get hold of. Okay, so that's what all of these weird words are talking about as a whole, because of course we want to understand that in order to understand what are those stocks. And I really like the way that you use the word stock there, Tom. Do we actually have access to then be able to utilize further down that value chain? So awesome. Thank you very much. Everybody put your hands together in that virtual silence for the wonderful Tom. As we now segue across to the fantastic Vita, who is sitting in Lisbon. So Vita, I don't know if you want to take yourself off mute and then begin to share your screen for your presentation. If you indeed want to do that as a whole. And Vita is going to, as I mentioned earlier on, he's not going to go through War and Peace, don't worry, he's only got 10 minutes, so he's gone for a shorter book, which is Anna Karenina. So over to you, Vita, with regards to responsible sourcing and the Anna Karenina principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. In fact, mixing Tolstoy and responsible mining seemed a great teaser to attract the audience to this presentation. But just before linking responsible sourcing and Tolstoy, I'd like to share with you two personal stories. And one just happened in one of these meetings in Geneva within a group that is discussing and advancing the United Nations framework classification. So in this meeting that roughly happens once per year in Geneva, there is an expert group, and one colleague there, one of the experts, asked the audience if you could choose one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you have the 17 now on your screen, but imagine that you are like a kind of superhero and that you could choose just one and implement it. If you could do that, which one would you choose? And of course, you should look for one of these Sustainable Development Goals that is capable of leveraging all the others. So which of these 17 responsible Sustainable Development Goals could, in fact, make all the others advance? It might be climate action, it might be no poverty. I will like to go back to this question at the end of my presentation, because I believe it sums really well how we can mix Tolstoy and responsible sourcing. That's the first history that I'd like to share with you. The second one, it happened when I was serving as president of the European Federation of Geologists. So I was there between 2013 and 2019. And my background is in mining. And in those years, there was a big discussion about responsible sourcing. So the Americans had the Dodd-Frank Act, and they were already implementing under the Obama administration some guidance to avoid minerals that were coming from conflict areas. So the discussion at European Parliament was ongoing. And in 2015, when the EFG realized that, we joined other groups that were lobbying the European Parliament to advance a regulation that aiming to curb the imports of minerals from conflict areas. And I would say that we were very successful in that. The image that everyone had was of these poor miners, many of them exploited by armed groups. And I was saying that we were very successful collectively, because in 2017, in the 16th of March, the regulation was approved. And that regulation basically defined conflict areas, and it only entered into force this year in 2020. But one of the goals was, in fact, to prevent the imports of these minerals coming from conflict areas. One of the areas that was targeted by the regulation was the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it just happens that I was never in Congo before March 2017, but later that year and the next year, I visited DRC several times. And to people who has never been in Congo, first it's difficult to understand how big the country is. The country is huge. It's basically half the size of the 28 European countries all put together. So it's very big, and it has no infrastructure. So you don't have a road connecting the two biggest cities in the country. So you need to rely on airplanes. You have a lot of jungle, and for those reasons, I mean, for the lack of infrastructure, you have many regions with that are ruled by warlords. In fact, there are more than 200 armed groups in the DRC, and just in Kivu, North and South Kivu, an area roughly the size of Austria, there are more than 60 armed groups there fighting, and they are using the minerals to fund their fight. So going to the DRC for the first time at the end of 2017, I was expecting this sort of environment, and what I found in the field trip was something completely different. So what I found, I was visiting the south of the country, the Katanga province, and their mining was being made by farmers. So it's something that I'm from Portugal. It's something that I remember my grandparents telling me about the 30s and the 40s in Portugal, when there was a huge rush for tungsten, and many farmers were in fact looking for tungsten that they were selling to suppliers. So this is happening now in Congo, in these regions. So you see farmers that are going to mine sites with their families, because they don't leave the children or the women behind, because they can be raped or kidnapped or attacked by other men from other villages or armed groups. So the whole family goes to the mine site, the whole family works there, and before the approval of the European Union regulation, they could make up to, let's say, $15 a day by collecting the minerals and selling them to buyers. After the approval of the EU regulation, many buyers left the country. So the Americans were already leaving, the Europeans also left, and the only ones who remained were the Chinese and the Lebanese. And as you can imagine, less buyers means less demand. Less demand makes the prices go down. So a family that was making $15 a day before was now making $5 a day. And they was just made poorer because of the European Union regulation. And of course, this is not what we were aiming at. So it was like a surprise to realize that we should have a different approach. So is there hope? So I believe, yes, that there is hope. And there is hope because we have several certification schemes. This table represents many of them. Some of them are covering the whole supply chain. Others are more focused on the mining or on the manufacturing stages. But the good news is that we have this in place, but there are still many weak points. And as was just mentioned before by Tom, sometimes you need to have some sort of expertise to understand if what is coming from this mine is what is going to that smelter. And I believe that technology can give a huge help to this. Technology, of course, based now in blockchain and also digital tags, can be a solution combined with the reporting and certification schemes, but it's probably not the solution. Going back to Tolstoy, now is where I link both things. Remember that the Anna Karenina principle exists because of the first quote of the book, the opening sentence from Tolstoy. So all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, meaning that if you fail in covering one specific factor, then all the one possible deficiency, all your endeavor may be doomed. I mean, may fail. People working in statistics or in management is probably familiar with that. But basically, this means that whatever the scheme that you have or whatever the system in place, if there is a deficiency, a possible deficiency, then it will probably fail. So we need to address this. And in my opinion, the solution can come from the answer to this question. So in this meeting in Geneva of the expert group on resources classification, many people was pointing partnerships as the sustainable development goal that was capable of leveraging all the others. Climate action was also something that was pointed by many, but a factor that also had some sort of alignment around it was responsible consumption and production, the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, meaning that if we manage to have sustainable and responsible consumption, and again, because consumers are the ones that are driving the manufacturers, and if consumers are aware on the origin of the products that are incorporated on the gadgets that they are buying and using, this can make a difference. So in my opinion, the challenge is clear. We need to engage in the supply chains, responsible sourcing. We need to engage consumers, and it's effective engagement of consumers that can in a way balance the deficiencies that the systems might have. And this is in line with the Anna Karenina principle. Thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Vita. That's fantastic. And yes, as per usual, you can hear that applause raining out behind those microphones. Just before I go to the questions, just to give a bit more time for some of them to filter in, because there's some really good commentary coming in at the moment. Do you want to just explain what the World Barometer is? Because this is fabulous and it's something that has come up previously during the conference so far.
Oh, yes, of course. So you have it now on the screen. So this is a news digest, and it's provided by the International Raw Materials Observatory. The observatory in itself is the outcome of an European Union funded project, and the European Federation of Geologists was the lead partner of this project. And the aim was to create some sort of non-profit organization capable of collecting information and providing and sharing best practice between different countries and organizations. So the observatory is doing that, and we are providing for free this bi-weekly digest of news, but we are not focused on news that coming only, let's say, from the industry or from the environment or from the sector. In fact, we are covering a wide spectrum of news, because we realize that sometimes you have factors that are coming from science or from politics, like let's say the China-US trade war, that can affect everything. It can affect your supply chain, it can affect your mining process, it can affect your business. So this World Barometer is provided for free. you can just go to the intro website and you seek that, or you just Google World Barometer and you find it, and you can just subscribe, and you'll be receiving every 2 weeks news that might have impact, about factors that might have impact on the mining industry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Witte. I think this is something here where, and as Ludovine is just saying on the chat, and this demonstrates how absolutely necessary it is to avoid that silo-based thinking, and because that's often, kind of promotes that weakest link in the process, and that's where the entire process falls over. Are you seeing more effort to avoid this amongst international organizations and other stakeholders working on these issues, so that trying to avoid the silo-based thinking, is there an active move towards that at the moment?
Well, to be honest, no. And that happens at all levels. At the intergovernmental organizations level, you can see that. I remember seeing this morning a presentation about a United Nations system that was endorsing a certification scheme, the development made by our colleagues in South Africa. And at the same time, this group that is developing, this expert group on resources management, that is working with UNES, so the United Nations European Europe Commission, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNES. It's also dealing with the management of resources. So there is not much communication. We see this also at European Union level. Sometimes DG Trade, it's not aligned with DG Grow. DG Trade is seeking some sort of, let's say, problems, thinking more on their own silo, and Growth is thinking on the industry. And this is quite common. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to have this sort of digests, because you can go there, you can just realize that something that is happening, let's say, on the energy might have an influence on the technology that you are using to mine. And this is important.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I think this is something where, as you just mentioning, so there are so many different groups, many of whom never speak to one another, or when they do, they misinterpret perhaps what the other group is trying to say, or the true intent of what they're trying to say. And it's something like Europe, of course, you've got lots of people who are trying to communicate when we all speak different languages as our first language. So trying to interpret what someone is really trying to intend can be very, very difficult. And it takes a lot of patience, I think, perhaps sometimes, to really understand what another person is trying to say. And something actually with that, in terms of misinterpretations, perhaps. So I was recently in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, working with some of the artisanal miners there. And this is actually quite a nice segue across into Sarah, who's coming up with the next talk. And this was something where those miners themselves, they are professional miners. They're just using different tools to what a large mining company might utilize. So you've got this spectrum from the artisanal and the small scale mining all the way through to the large scale mining. And it's interesting because I think whilst there's a huge amount of work that's been going on to try and understand different factors with regards to the different types of mining that goes on, there's again lots of misinterpretation with regards to that. Now we've got a talk on Friday from Estelle, who will be giving us a really nice overview with regards to what is artisanal mining, and I think that Sarah will be doing some of this in a second. But just with regards to your time in the DRC, Witte, so obviously you were seeing people who perhaps their primary mode of actually getting money, for example, was farming, but then there was this opportunity of mining. How do you think that's been changing? How do you think that's changed over the years?
Well, I was there doing an assessment for the World Bank of a mining project. And I must say that I don't see artisanal miners as the enemy, quite the opposite. I do believe that artisanal miner, in a way, is a more fair way of, let's say, sharing the benefits of mining. Because I also recognize that effective mining, I mean, to exploit resources in the most effective way, you need to have some sort of professional organization with equipment, knowledge, and people that artisanal miners cannot cope with. So, but combining the two, and Burkina Faso is one of the African countries that is doing that in a very effective way and successful, I would say. It's the best way, because then you can have the most effective way to exploit resources, and in a way to have exports and to have all this normal supply chain working as we know it in Europe. And at the same time, you can have like almost a fair social mining site, which they don't exploit much, but there is many people that depends on that. So the number of families is huge. Some countries, they are fighting artisanal miners like the enemy. And I don't believe this is the right approach. Also, what is of course needed is a clear legal framework and access to land, so you can, as a miner, know what you can count on, and people there can also understand what are the rules and what they can and they cannot do.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Fitter. And I think what you finished on there is hugely important. So we're not talking about us and them to any stretch, in any stretch of the imagination. All of us are wanting to make responsible use of the raw materials in the ground, and it doesn't matter what our backgrounds are, etc. I think it's a case of the more we can share our perspectives and our ideas, perhaps the more successful the outcome can be. So brilliant. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Another round of silent applause for you. Brilliant. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to dive into that world of A Tale of Two Minds. So yes, we're carrying on with that literary analogies that are going on there. And we're going to pass across now to Sarah, who is in Vancouver, or certainly somewhere a long way away from Lisbon at this precise moment in time. So Sarah, I don't know if you've got slides that you want to share. Now is a good moment to do that and to unmute your microphone, and we will come across to your wonderful self. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, really great segue. It couldn't have been better, actually. So thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to be speaking to you from primarily the perspective of a mineral exploration geologist who in the field got really inspired about this opportunity and this idea of there being two worlds, the sort of formal and visible mining industry, and then this somewhat hidden, informal, artisanal and small-scale mining industry that I think is often overlooked. I mean, recently, definitely, we've seen a lot more increased attention going to this sector, but traditionally, I think it's something that we haven't really put too much thought to, both as geologists and definitely as consumers. So yeah. Oh. Okay, so starting off with the story, how I got here. So basically, as I mentioned, I began my career as a mineral exploration geologist, and I think we're all pretty excited about this adventure and this opportunity to go out into underexplored or unexplored ground. And this is just one example where I arrived up with 800 square kilometers of gold and copper discovery potential. And so every geologist's dream is to find that million ounces of gold and be part of something big and exciting. And we're trained for that. So we look at mineralogy, geochemistry, geophysics, etc. But what we're not really thinking about, and what we've not been trained to think about, is the actual impact that we have on the ground level among those communities in which we're working, and the actual opportunities that are there at that time. So if we take the saying that we often hear, it takes 1,000 exploration projects to find one mine. That's a lot of opportunities for exploration geologists to have positive impacts in communities that are often very remote, perhaps underdeveloped, and in many degrees marginalized or left behind by the formal economy. So there is this opportunity here, I think, for the junior sector to do more and be more visible in this sense. And also something that I think is overlooked a little bit might have changed now, but overlooked in geology degrees and training is this presence of the other explorers. So it's not just us that are looking for these minerals. There is this huge part of the mining sector that exists, estimates that around 40 million miners globally, and they're looking for minerals ranging from precious minerals such as gold, gemstones. They're estimated to mine over 80% of the world's color gemstones, 20% of our gold, and also significant amounts of cobalt, things that are going into technology, for example. So they have a huge place in the supply chain, but to date have been somewhat overlooked. And just to kind of put the two on top of each other,
can I just interject just with regards to, I think your slides have been lost from being sharing. Do you want to just reshare your slides so we can all enjoy what you're looking at?
1 second.
And if it doesn't work, you're painting a fantastic picture anyway.
Good. Is that working now?
It's beginning to come through. Yep.
Okay, possibly connectivity.
Yes, that's perfect. On you go.
Great. Okay, so to continue. So I've basically overlaid the two worlds that we have here. So we have the distribution of artisanal and small-scale mining on a global scale, and then the percentage distribution of the mineral exploration budgets, again on a global scale. This data is actually from 2017, so it might not be the most up-to-date, but to give a broad idea. And what we can see is that a lot of our mineral exploration assets are obviously coinciding with areas of prominence in terms of artisanal and small-scale mining. So looking specifically at Latin America, for example, Peru, also DRC, West Africa, East Africa, etc. So these two worlds very much do interface, they do collide. And in terms of the risk to the formal mining sector, it's big. So I think Canada alone has $55 billion-ish of mineral exploration and mining assets in just Latin America alone. And in terms of the artisanal and small scale miners, they have a lot at stake as well. So as Vijay mentioned, this is a livelihood for people that maybe don't have much else, and possibly it complements subsistence farming. And it's a voice that's not often heard. So, I mean, we sort of all sit around talking about this very often, but we don't have artisanal miners representing here. And many of them are, you know, pretty good geologists and prospectors in their own rights. And as Sarah, I think, mentioned before, they're miners, basically, and these are our enterprises. Obviously, there's a spectrum, and I think we'll hear more about that on Friday from Estelle. And some are obviously illegal, and in the worst case, have a lot of very serious human rights and environmental issues, but not all are illegitimate as such, and many are, you know, viable small mining enterprises. And so I love this quote from a meeting a couple of years ago, where basically there was a call to action from artisanal and small scale miners to basically ask us as a society, and I guess as a community, to start eliminating this language and discourse that is worsening the stigma around their sector, and to find ways that we can actually empower them to chart their own vision of development. And I think that's really interesting and exciting, presents an opportunity for this sector to actually be recognized and have the sort of impact and growth that it wants, that makes sense for its own local context, not necessarily what we from the outside might perceive is what is required. So I dove very deep into this subject during the course of my business degree a couple of years ago, and I mapped out all different things, and this is a little bit complicated, but what normally happens when you have these two worlds colliding is that they're basically competing. And so both of them want access to prospective ground, both of them want rights to those minerals, both of them want to derive value from that. But what normally happens is, if you do face this interface, is that you might have in the beginning an informal sort of happy coexistence, but more often than not, when the stakes rise and we move towards defining a mineral resource and into formalized mining, conflict can arise, because basically there's one of two outcomes. Either the government moves on the artisanal and small scale miners, or they might actually evict the foreign large scale mining company or exploration company. And so basically it's not ideal, because I guess what my sort of question is, and to the previous presentation, is, do we actually have to compete? Can we not find a way to create a win-win scenario where both can operate in some ways side by side or in proximity? Can we create space for both within the natural resource governance of that host country and within the business models that we are operating. So a little bit more on the challenge. So essentially, yeah, is there a business case to do better? I mean, as mineral exploration geologists, we are sort of the first step in this mining project pipeline. We are the first ones to get our boots on the ground and often interface with these communities, but yet we're not really, I guess, engaged or embedded within the CSR teams. We're not maybe interfacing with, governments or NGOs or other entities that might more traditionally work with artisanal and small-scale mining. And I think there's a space to do more there, especially when we look at the chances of success. So finding an economically viable deposit is hard enough as it is, but this really interesting report by Rachel Davis and Daniel Franks, which I would recommend if you haven't already had a look, maps out pretty clearly that if we take, for example, I think they took 50 cases where they had prolonged conflict at a project, and this is not just limited to artisanal and small-scale mining, but in general conflict that we face during our projects operations, and 2/3 are abandoned at pre-feasibility and feasibility stage. So that sort of transition from exploration to advanced exploration and resource definition is really critical to get right. In the best case scenario, you might be looking at $10,000 to $50,000 a day in standby costs, wasted time. In the worst case scenario, that asset is abandoned, and that could be, millions and billions of value dollars lost. And it's lost for the foreign company and the investors and everything else, but it's also lost at a national level for that host country. And during my research, it came up, I talked to governments and investors and mid-tiers and majors and things, and government representatives talk about this. One of the biggest challenges for them is to actually derive opportunity and socioeconomic value from the natural resource industry for their nation, both locally and nationally. And I think there's a big opportunity for private sector to play a greater role in promoting these opportunities. And a nice quote as well from that Davis and Frank's paper, just sort of saying, we don't measure the dollar value of social license law. I think, we're starting to move towards that, and that's exciting to see in the industry. But what the quote sort of highlights is that a lot of juniors don't realize that, yes, you're doing drilling and you're adding value in terms of gold ounces or whatever commodity you're working with, but if you get things wrong, you're actually overall eroding value from your project, and that project might never sell in the worst case scenario. And it's not just about what the majors or the mid-tiers are thinking in terms of an M&A, it's the whole supply chain, and I think we're changing at a global level. So consumers are asking more and more where are commodities coming from. We see new initiatives like Fair Mined and Fair Trade Gold springing up. We see, things like the LBMA Precious Metals Code, and we heard from LME yesterday. We see government starting to try and work with and actually empower and build more responsible small-scale mining sectors, such as in Ghana. And we see also the legal and policy landscape changing. So we had this sort of landslide or landmark case against Nevsun, who will be tried in Canada, and that really changes, I guess, the playing field for the mining industry. I mean, there's not really any, not that there should have been before, but I think more and more we have to realize that there has to be, a better and a right way to do business in these countries in which we're operating. It's no longer enough just to define an economically viable deposit. And again, I guess a couple of good quotes from my research. There's this pressure on the junior mining sector. So the majors see this junior sector as actually being, really, really important. Exploration expenditure is increasing and discovery rates are dropping. And there's a problem on the horizon from 10 years from now as the pipeline of new projects is drying up and the junior sector could fail to deliver. In mergers and acquisitions, the quality of the inherited social licenses to operate is crucial. It's of even more importance than the potential gold ounces, as one failure on a single project will affect the entire company's reputation across all its operations. And we also see investors starting to put more weight on sustainability and ethics, or even prioritizing that over potential financial gain. As for them, it's all about managing reputational risk and looking for companies that have demonstrated successful relationships in their communities. So with every challenge, there's an opportunity. And I think often we look at this sort of concept of social license to operate, which has been floating around the sort of top 10 risks in the EY ranking for the last 5 or more years, but has been consistently ranking #1 for the last 2. I think we often think of the social license to operate as something as sort of fragile, or, you know, it's not necessarily, it's a risk. We don't really know how to keep it. Maybe it's a little bit abstract, but what if we start reframing this concept of license to operate as actually an opportunity, and an opportunity to innovate in terms of how we do business as a sector, both in exploration, but all the way across the mining lifecycle. At the end of the day, mineral exploration companies and artisanal and small-scale mining enterprises pretty much want the same thing. They don't want to lose access to their land, to their mineral prospects or active mines in the case of ASM. They want to attract investors, and they want to access capital to keep going. In the case of the junior explorer, they want to end up with a good deal, a good M&A with a bigger company. And in the case of the artisanal and small-scale miners, they want to be able to access, or, you know, it would be good for them to be able to access markets on more fair terms and access capital on more fair terms, and also to be able to take advantage of appropriate technology to improve productivity, efficiency, and mine more safely. And I think there's an opportunity to use scale here, and I think that's where the role of the exploration geologist can come in, and perhaps to date hasn't been used to its full advantage. So if you take, for example, a mineral exploration concession, you might have 50 different deposits, maybe 3 of which you will actually drill, and the rest you sort of set to one side, and you might come back to some of them, you might sort of re-explore or find new things, but a lot of them will just never be economic. Whereas at the small scale, mining scale, they could be economically viable. And just with that idea of having proximity with another company, it creates sort of an access or an opportunity to basically leverage the best of both worlds. Because one of the issues that governments often face is ASM is just geographically so distant that it's hard even for Ministry of Mines or geological surveys to get out and monitor or work with these communities. But if you have a junior there, maybe for 5 or 10 years, that in itself presents, I guess, a channel or an avenue to do something where you can create value for both parties. And ultimately, that's in the best interest of the exploration company, because if they can demonstrate this sort of working, or, you know, this good relationship where both parties are being honored and, you know, valued, it's a strength in terms of that social license and then that M&A later down the line. So I had to put in a rock because I'm a geologist ultimately, but yeah, a little bit of drill core there. But and I think what I wanted to say on this side basically is that, yeah, we're good at finding deposits. That's what geologists do. So let's find ways to better leverage those skills and start talking to, you know, governments, NGOs, social ventures, and ASM communities. Let's find ways to actually be part of these conversations and see if we can push the story forward. So essentially, to sum up, it's no longer business as usual. I think we can all agree everything is changing, right from, you know, the consumers through to the refineries, investors, etc. So what can we do in terms of business model innovation? And I guess, you know, you could say the sort of cynical motivation is to have a strategic advantage, to have a strategic competitive advantage, to add dollar value to your projects. But this advantage is, again, sort of felt on both sides, because both artisanal and small-scale mining and the juniors or whatever else down the pipeline, they want to retain access to their deposits and to their mining operations. But I think in terms of looking beyond just that, you know, the dollar value is actually about increasing and improving natural resource equity so that people can better benefit from their own resources, both at a local and a national level. And so what are we seeing so far in the industry? I think, I mean, this is sort of a general schematic just based on this idea of curve of adoption or diffusion of innovations. But this idea of ASM sort of, I guess, you know, just let's disengage or let's not work with them, it's too much of a risk, that doesn't really stick anymore. And we've seen that. I mean, you can try and remove the problem or move the problem, but it doesn't work, and it comes back. And it's not really a problem either, because these are just people trying to earn a living. They need to be included in sort of this, I guess, in the mining sector as a visible and viable component. So what we've seen in the past and what we're seeing maybe more of, I think, which is encouraging, is people starting to innovate different types of business models. And these are coming from different angles. And I mean, some of them are junior explorers or mid-tiers, but what we're seeing is sort of social ventures springing up, things like Boxenam that some of you might have heard of in Burkina Faso, who's working with artisanal and small-scale gold mining. We've seen impact investors getting involved. So the Chambers Federation in the DRC, again, working with small-scale and artisanal gold mining. There's a mining company talking about working with artisanals in Tanzania. So actually setting up a processing plant and processing their ore. So is it something that we're going to see more of, I guess? Because to date, I guess during my research and during my different conversations that I was having, it seemed to be a lot of cynicism. So people have tried these sort of coexistence models in the past and they haven't always worked out. I mean, you can do a quick Google search for mining companies that have tried this and ended up with conflict scenarios despite doing their best to invest in artisanal and small-scale mining. But are we sort of at this early stage of the curve where people are testing the water and it hasn't quite worked and it's definitely not scaled, but will we start to see different models emerging where we can see scale and we can see impact that can last and actually result in healthy collaboration or coexistence? I think ultimately we're always going to have companies or individuals that just won't like this idea. And that's natural. So many people are highly adverse to risk or highly conservative and will only participate with ASM if forced to do so in terms of compliance. But I think there's a really interesting space opening up here at the beginning part of the curve, and I would love to see geologists being more involved in this moving forward. I think we have a lot to add and a lot to contribute to this space. And so, yeah, I would invite anyone to get in touch, and those of you that already have, thank you. I'm looking forward to connecting properly and having bigger discussions around this. And yes, thanks for the opportunity to talk, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. And as per usual, you can hear that amazing round of applause raining through the muted microphones around the world. So thank you so much for that. Now, there's some fantastic discussion going on the chat, on the Q&A, also on YouTube as well. And Sarah, just to build on your final, I guess, offer/challenge, there's a question that comes in from Chikomeni Manda on YouTube, and they are asking, how do you think a junior geologist might be able to be attracted to artisanal and small-scale mining? Because often those junior geologists, the career path that is normally set out is just through those larger scale companies. So how do you think we can maybe open up people's eyes so that they see some of these more exciting business models that you alluded to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Tico. Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are people like me, I can't be the only one, and I know there's others. There are geologists out there that are genuinely interested in this, but I think it's a valid point because artisanal and small scale miners obviously don't have the capital or the resources to bring in maybe, geological consultant to their projects. And that's where I think it's interesting to start creating these dialogues between the junior explorers and the artisanal and small scale mining communities, perhaps using the Ministry of Mines or geological surveys as sort of the channel to create those links. Because, I mean, every company has, this sort of CSR budget, but I think this idea of corporate social responsibility is changing from something that has been maybe more sort of philanthropic in the past to something that has to be more, grounded in business and sustainable impact beyond just donations or giving. So, for example, why not allocate some of your geologists to spend so many days a year working with artisanal miners in proximity to your concession or perhaps on your concession, doing some basic, resource definition, asking some questions, sharing information, sharing knowledge. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that dialogue in both directions. And that's certainly something that I've really enjoyed in my career. And I know that often, this relationship might be seen as sort of as one way or extractive, and then traditionally, often maybe it has been that way, but I don't think it has to continue to be that way. And that's sort of the story that I think we need to start focusing on to move this narrative forward. So yeah, great question.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Sarah. And another round of applause to say thank you very much for joining us here today, very early in the morning from Vancouver. Brilliant.
No, thank you.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we're going to stay in a similar vein, actually, but now we're going to come across to Frederick, who is going to be discussing with us COVID-19 mitigation for both miners and those mining communities as a whole. So Frederick, if you would like to unmute yourself, and if you have slides to share, now is your opportunity to start sharing them, because the baton of power will pass across to you. And over to yourself, sir. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you so much. And to the other Sarah, thank you for this fascinating presentation that you just gave. Really, that was very interesting. I only joined at the end, but that was fascinating. So this extraordinary conference that you've put together, thank you so much, Sarah and Rose, for inviting me to be part of this experience. And remarkable to see that a number of people are indeed taking part, and I'm sure the resource that you're creating through this is also going to be an extremely useful one. So just a few words of introduction from me first about True Footprint. We are a Cambridge, UK-based company that works on producing ESG, sustainability and impact data, and better results, and working with a range of institutions, from asset managers to companies and local communities in that process. And just a bit of research that we did last year in the mining industry, which is one of our focus areas, we found that of their non-financial reporting, and just minimize this, of the non-financial reporting, 70% of material indicators used were of input and output indicators. And 26% were outcome indicators, meaning only 4% were impact indicators. So that is in their non-financial, in the sustainability reporting. And why does that matter? It matters because without any consistent focus on outcomes, it's very difficult to know what we're actually achieving. So what we do in True Footprint is we help to capture outcome data. And I just gave here an example from what COVID-19 type work could look like. So an input is capital, technology, nature, is natural resources, is $100,000 for COVID-19 relief. The outputs would be what was spent on that, and it could be the goods purchased, the training provided, publicity materials disseminated or posted, etc. What we need to know is whether that stuff is available, right? Is it actually being used? Is it accessible? And is that which was donated, did it not just arrive on site, but is it actually in use 3 months later, 6 months later? Because only then can we capture the impacts that we want to achieve. And that's what we help to do at True Footprint, is to capture outcome data, both top down at the corporate and the asset levels, and then bottom up through and from the workers and the communities where the mining takes place. Now, some mining takes place in very remote areas, and there are hardly any communities to speak of. But in many other areas, indeed, there are communities there, and there is, of course, the case of artisanal mining as well. Now, how does this then relate to the situation of COVID-19? So the mining industry has a long history of needing to address health issues, right? And whether it is airborne diseases that are caused, that cause long-term health effects like cancer, hearing loss, and obviously physical impairments, deaths, serious injuries from mining. And in more recent decades, the big concerns around tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and malaria. And so the history is a long one of the mining industry having to engage with health. This is nothing new. But where with COVID-19, first of all, we have a global pandemic. We have a transmittable disease. And we have a disease where the contours of it are not well known. We don't know what's going to happen with it. We also know that it's of course not sufficient to curb it within the mine and among the workers if the community surrounding it, the families of the workers, etc., continue to be affected. And so if we draw on some past experiences, we know that among the risks that can occur, especially in countries with the most fragile health systems, are that some populations are going to be at particular risk, and that there's going to be groups of people who are severely exposed. We know that this virus does discriminate. And the risks in countries with fragile health systems include misallocated resources and health equipment. So in the Ebola crisis, 1/3 of the Ministry of Health's budget in Sierra Leone disappeared, was unaccounted for. We know that PPE might not get to where the authorities think it's meant to get. And in the extreme cases, you can have ghost workers and even ghost hospitals. So in the Ebola crisis, again, in 2014-15, there were at the minimum an estimated 6,000 ghost health workers in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Health workers who only existed on paper. Now, clearly you can't fight Ebola any more than a COVID-19 with people who exist only on paper. And so the proposition is that if we could have better quality of data on what is not being spent and raised, but what is actually accessible and available on the ground, this would help a great deal for both health workers and eventually also the mining companies. And the only way to do this in a realistic manner is actually to engage health workers and the at-risk populations and the communities themselves. So this is in the spirit of what we do in our day-to-day work. This is simply an adaptation of our core, one of our core tools. We call it the True Footprint Field App, which is, as I said, driven by people on the ground. And it's only the people on the ground who can really tell us what is happening. And you can't rely simply on the ministries of health or on healthcare workers or on people on their own. But by triangulating this, we should have a good idea of what is happening. So the app is very simple, takes you through various steps, and it allows us then to do a mapping. Sorry, there's something that's gone wrong with the graphics here, but it allows you to do a mapping of where certain issues then have arisen. And so we have we are now actively exploring actually with mining companies, but we have a fairly significant group of NGOs and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, malaria as a partner in this effort. And so several of the NGOs we're working with are in countries where there is significant mining taking place. And we're hopeful of being able to engage some of the mining communities and mining companies in that process. And with a twofold view to this, really. So in the first instance, simply providing far better insights into what is happening around the accessibility of safe medical care and regular medical care in these areas. But for those who are not already convinced of this, also introducing the notion that actually communities are one of the best sources of verification of what is going on the ground if you put the right tools in their hands. They ultimately need to be the owners of those outcomes, right? If they don't care about functioning roads, education, access to water, and functioning health services, then we have a basic problem, right? And the proposition is that they need to be the drivers of the change, the owners of the outcome, and therefore also the producers of the data. I think my time is up. So I just wanted to introduce this concept to you of really community-driven data production and the verification of outputs and the production of outcome data at the community level, and the triangulation through health workers, but also from local communities. They have to ultimately be the owners of what's meant to benefit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frederick. I think that was a fantastic talk and actually builds on really nicely from what we've been hearing earlier on today, especially with regards to trying to look at the real impact of what some of these initiatives, for example, might be aiming at as a whole. Just with regards to some of the questions that are coming through from us here that we have on the Q&A and on the chat, it was unfortunate, I think, that we maybe couldn't see your maps in all their great detail. Would you be able to just, summarize where are some of the areas where people have got larger problems, or perhaps they are missing out on equipment, etc.? Would you be able to describe what some of the summaries are from the maps that we couldn't quite see?
Okay, Sarah, we're really early days with this, but I was talking just the other day with a doctor working with a large French company that's going to donate some very serious equipment in various African countries. They cost tens of thousands of dollars a piece. Mm-hmm. And he got it immediately that, it's not just a question of verifying whether the equipment arrives in the hospitals, but is it still there 2 weeks later? Is it still there 2-3 months later? 6 months later, right? Because it's all well and good if it arrives, but what if the senior doctor then removes it and takes it to his private clinic, or indeed sometimes even sells it? And so what we are mapping and seeing is that ability of engaging the people who care the most about this. Who cares more about this than the communities on the ground? Then mothers of children, daughters of elderly people, right, who are concerned about what's happening. No one cares more about them or the local healthcare worker. And so it's simply a question of empowering them to be part of this. But it's not enough to just report problems. So it's very easy to just do that. What we do with our application is also to capture where and how problems are being solved, because that's where the real gold dust is, if I can use a mixed metaphor, is that's where we are able to capture the innovations that people are creating, right? And then learning can happen as a result of that. If you only report problems, it can actually be very frustrating, because it is only ever one part of the picture, and problem reporting on its own doesn't lead to problem solving. So what we emphasize is the fact that people have to be part of the problem-solving process themselves.
So with that then, Frederick, have you got any really good news stories where you're seeing some of those solutions coming through and really working, or is it too early with regards to COVID-19?
I'm afraid it's a bit too early, yeah.
Okay, so then just to spin that, and one of the regions that we've been talking about a little bit today has been that southern region within the Democratic Republic of Congo, where of course a lot of the world's cobalt, for example, comes from. So if we take Kolwezi, where there are lots of mines around that area, and I think as of today, they have yet to report a confirmed case of COVID-19, whereas 100 kilometers away in Lubumbashi, actually there are a number of cases that have been confirmed there. If you were working in the Kolwezi area at this precise second in time, what would you be doing to try and make sure that that community is prepared for what has the potential to be coming through their door very, very soon?
Well, so the power of this approach, thanks a lot for that question, and we're not there, but I'm very hopeful that we might be able to do so, is, with track and trace apps, you need a lot of people to sign up for them, because otherwise it just doesn't work, right? It's all about the numbers. Here, it's actually not all about the numbers. It's about local existing networks. So if we, for example, were able to mobilize, I don't know, Caritas, or even a handful of locally existing NGOs that have their existing networks, we don't need very large numbers of people to make us well aware of what is the state of affairs in the various health centers, right? Simply to do the systematic work. But the point is that it's not enough to just do it at one point in time. The real value comes from doing it on a continuous basis, right? And so when that mining company makes a donation, and some of them have been making large donations, you want to make sure that it arrives, that it's in use, and that it continues to be accessible, right? And that's how we know then that the system is resilient, because at that point, we know that the healthcare system at the local level, even in the most basic form, is actually pretty well equipped to deal with it. After all, in Congo, right, they have had years of the Ebola crisis, so they know very well, actually, some of the things they need to do. And it's the co-discoverer of the Ebola virus, this Congolese doctor whose name escapes me at the moment, I'm sorry to say, but he is the one who makes the point, is that social engagement, community engagement is the first line of defense. It's not medical doctors going out there. It's communities engaging. That is the first line of defense. Yeah? Now, for that, it means networks. It means people who know each other. You can't build community engagement overnight. So you need to draw on existing networks.
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely fantastic, Frederick. And I think, thank you so much for sharing this with all of us. And my final question for you would be, so, you know, so for example, we're talking here about, say, the DRC. Does this work just as well in somewhere like the UK, where perhaps people are trying to get used to a new normal, or, you know, whatever the case might be? So does it work just as well somewhere like here, where we're sitting right now? Or some of us are sitting right now, I should say.
I love your question, and our commitment is absolutely to that. And you know, this is, you know, this unique experience we're all going through. But you have an inquiry from San Mateo County in the US, a very, very specific location there. But with our partners, yes, this is actually going to be deployed in a couple of, more than a couple of OECD countries as well.
Brilliant. Well, that is really good to hear, because I think perhaps as one of the mere members of the global population, we need all the help we can get. So thank you very, very much, sir. And we're all putting our hands together for you behind our muted microphone. So thank you very, very, very much. That's brilliant. Great. So, ladies and gentlemen, great. Thanks very much, Frederick. So now we are going to shift gears slightly. So we're going to go from human diversity, as it were, to the broader world of biodiversity, and some fantastic technology that Kat brings to the table through her company. So Kat, I don't know if you would like to unmute yourself and then start to share your slides. So thank you very much. We can see you there. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your virtual hands together for the wonderful Dr. Kat Bruce. Over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for sticking around till towards the end of the day. I'm going to show you some animal pictures, so hopefully that will be nice, if nothing else. So my name's Kat Bruce, and I'm the founder of a UK-based company called Nature Metrics. And we're specialists in DNA-based biodiversity monitoring. So as a company, we work all over the world, but particularly specialize in environmental impact assessments in diverse tropical ecosystems. And the more projects we do, the more sort of clients we work with, the more excited I get about what these tools can do, and just the fact that we have new tools coming to the table at this time for addressing biodiversity loss. Because it's something that's incredibly difficult to do. So, you know, if we go back just a few years ago, actually the whole environmental narrative was really just about climate change. And that's changed dramatically in the last few years. And we've really seen biodiversity sort of very rapidly climbing the agenda in environmental governance. So monitoring and mitigation of biodiversity impacts is required by standards from the IFC and other sort of financial lenders, and also from industry bodies. And we're seeing as well an increasing level of commitment at a corporate level to attaining no net loss of biodiversity sort of across the whole business operation. And that's particularly within the mining industry. And the framework that's often followed for achieving no net loss or net gain of biodiversity is known as the mitigation hierarchy. And this sets out that first thing you have to do is avoid any loss of biodiversity that you can. And then anything that can't be avoided needs to be minimized. Any actual losses are then restored as far as possible afterwards. And as a last resort, you can use offsetting of biodiversity for any residual losses. Now, it's worth just thinking about what we mean when we talk about biodiversity, because most of the focus in biodiversity assessments and action plans and things tends to be on the sort of large charismatic species. And these are important because they've often got sort of cultural or economic importance. But actually, most species consist of small organisms. So those are insects, other invertebrates, microorganisms, and these are the things that are actually driving ecosystem function and creating long-term ecosystem resilience. So both of these components of biodiversity pose monitoring challenges for us. The sort of large charismatic wildlife can be really difficult to find. It's often quite rare and difficult to encounter, so you can miss it easily. The small things, we can usually pick them up in large numbers, but they're really difficult to identify. So just to turn that sample of nature into data, we have to separate out the different species. And that usually involves looking at every individual organism underneath the microscope. And it's just not practical to do that at large scales. But if we're really going to assess biodiversity impacts, we have to be able to gather data across that full spectrum of the different groups. And really, we need to be able to do that on a repeated basis so that we can measure and characterize the impacts of disturbance. And there's a fundamental problem, which is just before we can even start, we need a baseline. We need to know what lives where. And that is incredibly challenging. So if you think about sort of trying to do this across a large tropical landscape, for example, you're going to have to send out many different teams focusing on different groups of organisms to conduct different sorts of surveys across large areas. And that takes an awful lot of time. It's incredibly expensive. And it also puts a lot of people at quite high risk because you're sending them into pretty inhospitable environments where they're a long way from medical help. And then after all of that time and cost and risk, actually the data that you come out with, however great the team, is usually really incomplete and very patchy, and that makes it very difficult to replicate, to assess change and to be able to actually demonstrate progress in things like no net loss. So DNA-based tools really provide a step change in the acquisition of comprehensive on-the-ground biodiversity data. And they do that by both making the surveys easier to carry out and more replicable, so we can do more of them, and at the same time overcoming the identification challenge for those small organisms. So altogether, that means we can get more data on more species and ultimately make better evidence-based decisions for biodiversity. So there are two sort of main elements of DNA-based monitoring that contribute to this. One is the ability to sequence the DNA of many different species in a single reaction. So you can take a mixed species sample, and instead of going through every specimen one by one, we can just blitz the whole sample and sequence it at once. And that's a process called metabarcoding. The other element is the ability to detect species, not by having to actually find the organism itself, but just by finding traces that they've left behind in the environment. And that's what we call environmental DNA. So metabarcoding is something that we can apply to all sorts of different samples. So any sample that contains the DNA of multiple species, we can metabarcode, right? So whether that's insect trap samples, soils, sediments, marine sediments, or water. And you take your sample, you extract all of the DNA from it, you stick it through a high throughput DNA sequencer, through a computational pipeline, and at the end you get a list of species. And we can actually put many different mixed species samples in for analysis in parallel, so you can generate really vast data sets in just a matter of weeks. And we can choose to look at all sorts of different taxonomic groups from the same samples. Now, when we're applying metabarcoding to water, that's when we're using environmental DNA. So environmental DNA, or eDNA, just refers to when we're using traces of DNA that have been left behind by the organism in the water. So animals, when they're in water, are shedding cells in the same way that when we touch something, we leave fingerprints with DNA in it. So the animals are leaving like DNA fingerprints in the water. At the same time, rainfall is washing DNA off the land. And so the species that haven't been in the water but have been around it on the land, their DNA ends up in there too. So the water becomes like a soup of genetic material of the wildlife that's been in and around it. And we can capture that just by passing the water through a filter, and the DNA gets stuck on the filter membrane. And then we can take it and sequence it and find out what lives there. So we have developed these really simple user-friendly sampling kits, which are designed to be used in really remote environments. They're super easy to use. Every kit contains everything that you need to take one sample. And basically you've got your filter membrane inside this plastic disc. You pull water up in a syringe, screw the syringe onto the disc, push the water through, do that as many times as you can, pop a preservative in, cap on each end, and then that filter just gets posted to the lab where we metabarcode it. And anybody can do this. So we work with everybody from environmental consultants, engineers, conservationists, local communities. We work with school children and citizen science projects. And the great thing is that whether it's me going out there with years of experience as an eDNA specialist or a kid who's just been told about it for the first time, the sample that they collect will be of equal quality. So it doesn't matter who collects it, you get the same quality of sample back at the lab. And that's great because it means that we can really sort of democratize the acquisition of biodiversity information. So you can use local contractors or people who might be on site regularly without having to mobilize a whole sort of specialist survey team. That means you can survey more regularly at other times of year than you might be able to normally. It also means you can engage local communities and stakeholders in collecting that data and get them involved in the process. So this is what we mean about sort of making surveys easier and more replicable so that we can gather more data and improve our decision making. So here's a real life example. This is from a landscape scale baselining exercise in the northern Peruvian Amazon, which was carried out with WWF across this region here. And they were really targeting pink river dolphins and Amazon manatees. So the WWF team went out and collected 4 water samples in each of 40 locations across this region and sent them to the lab for metabarcoding for vertebrates. And when we got the data back, the first thing we looked at was to check that we could find these, that we'd found these 2 species. So you can create these sort of distribution maps for where each species is found and how many of the 4 replicates each one is showing up in. So you can see here, even though you can't count the individuals per se, you can start to use this sort of occupancy and frequency as a bit of a proxy for how common or rare things are. So the manatee here is much less common than the dolphin. But what was amazing about this data set was that in addition to these 2 species, we had another 673 species in this data set. So we've essentially done baselining for 675 vertebrate species for the field effort that you would have spent just doing one species. And a lot of the mammals that we picked up were also of conservation significance. This allows us to pick out species that might carry additional mitigation requirements so that they're known early on. You can plan the project around them, save cost, and also have better conservation outcomes for those species. And a lot of the data is taken up with fish. Fish are obviously extremely economically important for local communities. So being able to monitor them is really important. It's very difficult using conventional methods. So this was actually from a different project in the Amazon where we did side-by-side netting and eDNA, and you get 5 times as many fish species from the eDNA as you do from the netting. So it's an incredibly sensitive and powerful approach. But also because the fish is such a diverse group here in the Amazon, we can start to use them to be able to map the different sorts of ecosystems and their connectivity in this area. So if you look at the plot on the right-hand side here, each point is a sample, and the closer together 2 points are, the more species those samples have in common. So they're coloured according to the region of the landscape that they're taken from, and those match up with the colours on the map. So you can see that when you've got samples that are taken from the same area, they basically have quite similar species in them, whereas samples that are taken from different areas in the landscape have got quite different species. And that allows us to start to identify particular areas or habitats or conditions that are ecologically very distinct from other ones and might be important to conserve within the landscape. And you can also see things like, in this case, the effect of barriers, so whether those are man-made barriers like dams or natural ones like gorges, as in this case, where the presence of that barrier leads to there being significantly different communities on either side of it, and talks to how easy it is for things to move around within that landscape. And this is the kind of analysis that normally we would actually do with the sort of small organisms, which are very highly species rich and powerful. But because the fish are so, there's so many species of fish here, we're able to do that here. And it starts to allow you to take more of a kind of big data approach to understanding whole ecosystems and habitats and sort of mosaics within landscapes. So this is the same kind of analysis here, this time based on insects. So these are from flying insects within plantation forests. And so you've got 15 different sites. Some of them have got a pure oak crop, some of them are pure pine crop, and some of them had a mixture of oak and pine. Those are the red ones. And so we trapped insects, several different traps per site. And you can see a couple of things. One is that actually the mixed crop insect communities are just the same as the pure oak one. So adding the pine doesn't bring the pine specialists into those sites. The pine communities are quite different, but you can see also there's these two sites over on the right-hand side here that are really quite different from the other sites in terms of the insect communities that they've got. So that means that those sites have got specialist species in them that aren't found in the other sites. So if we were thinking about where we were going to put an impact, if we were going to lose a bit of area, then you could say, well, if we lose those sites, they may not be the most species rich sites, but if we lose those ones, we will lose overall biodiversity from this area. So by knowing that, we can make an informed decision about where to place our impacts. We can use the same approach again for restoration. So in this case, we're trying to restore sort of grassed over trackways and turn them into nice heathland habitat. So here you can see that this is based on ground arthropods, so spiders and beetles and things. So you can see the heathland communities on the left-hand side are really different from the grassy trackways, which are bright green ones on the right-hand side. There's very little overlap in the species that are present in those different habitats. So conceptually during restoration, what you'd want to see is that over time, the sort of fingerprint from the trackways would move towards the heathland ones until they overlapped completely and you had a typical heathland community. And here we've got a couple of interim points. So we've got two different treatments that have been applied to modify these trackways, a very light touch one, which has had very little effect at all, and a much more aggressive one, which does seem to have been sort of partially effective. So you'd want to continue monitoring at this point and sort of see whether those communities continue to become more like the heathland ones. So then when we get to offsetting, you can again use very similar sort of approaches to look at the ecological equivalency of the sites that you select for offsetting. And there's always this issue about long-term monitoring of offset sites and whose responsibility that is and how it can actually be done. And this is where being able to use local stakeholders and people who are around in the area to continue gathering data on a long-term basis to check that those sites continue to have the biodiversity value that is ascribed to them is really valuable. So basically, sort of these DNA monitoring techniques allow us to just gather biodiversity data at a scale that hasn't been possible before. Using the metabarcoding, we can get data across a really wide cross-section of biodiversity based on a very efficient field sampling program, because you can take each sample and look for different types of diversity within that sample. You also get much more data per field effort and per unit effort in the field. So just take fish from water, even just from the fish, you're getting a lot more data from the water samples than from conventional methods. But then from those same samples, you can also get all of the data that you need on your mammals and your amphibians. You can get a lot of data on birds and reptiles as well. And it's all non-invasive. We haven't had to catch anything or stress it out or handle it. That means that we can use smaller field teams and shorter trips, so you put fewer people at risk for less long. And at the same time, we can get more people out there taking samples by using people who are around in the local area, using on-site contractors, using local communities and local stakeholders. And that allows us to monitor more regularly and more widely, and also to have these additional sort of community engagement opportunities. So there's lots of benefits of having just the sort of greater amount of data. Fundamental to it all really is just being able to generate these high resolution baselines at the outset that we can use for detecting key species and for monitoring against as the program progresses. So that's pretty much it from me. I hope that sort of sums up how we can make, gather more data on more species using these techniques and hopefully make better decisions for biodiversity. So thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Kat. And yes, as per usual, you can hear that amazing applause coming through those muted microphones right now. And this is something here, Kat, where every time I hear you speak, it just blows my mind with excitement with regards to what you can actually do with this technology. Is this something that is totally brand new, or is it becoming more prolific across the world in terms of people being able to use this technique?
It's very much it's very much in the process of becoming mainstream. So if you look at within like the UK and Europe, for example, the idea of using this for doing routine, regular fisheries monitoring is, you know, that is being used. In terms of the more comprehensive monitoring, we're at the stage of doing a lot of pilot projects, usually sort of starting to run these tools alongside the conventional monitoring surveys to see how they match up, and also to start building up the local reference databases that are needed in different areas so we can name species precisely. But you know, it can already provide more data than you get from conventional surveys. So there's with new technology, there's always a sort of tendency to hold it to a bar of perfection. This is something that can already do a lot more than we can do without it. So yeah.
I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I think lots of us are probably sitting around this virtual conference room with lots of ideas of where it could be applied. And just on that, because obviously the majority of the conversation today has obviously been around the extraction of rock from the ground, so things like mining, and you've done all of your, your great work, for example, in Peru, et cetera, have you done anything around how the biodiversity may vary with mining changing a landscape? Have you done any work on that?
Yeah, so I mean, particularly with so we've been involved in some sort of small scale EIA projects and mining projects where they've needed to monitor, for example, fish, crayfish, rare pond turtles, things like that. But they've been sort of relatively small scale. There have been some really nice studies that have been published recently where they've looked at how insect communities, for example, vary as you go from the impact site sort of out into the undisturbed habitat. So you can build that sort of gradient which shows the site-based impact, and then you've got your baseline to restore against afterwards.
Brilliant. No, I think I personally can think of lots of different areas where it would be fantastic to bring in what you've got here. There's a very very good and very practical question that has come in from Ema, if I may, and I realise that we're going slightly over time, but I think that is perfectly appropriate, if not slightly selfish from my own part. And Ema asks if, and she apologises if she missed this, but how long do the DNA samples actually last within the preservative, and where, so a separate question, where do you get the database of the DNA profiles?
So yeah, really good questions. So the preservative will keep the DNA stable for at least a couple of months. So we say sort of try and get the samples to the lab within a month or so. We've just been testing this out actually and running it up to about 6 months, and it stays pretty stable. So yeah, and it doesn't need refrigeration either, so it's stable at ambient temperature, even in the tropics. In terms of the reference databases, there are sort of universal, publicly available reference databases, which we use as our basis, but they are quite error prone. So we do a lot of in-house curation of those. And then what tends to happen is that within the bigger projects, we also add to them. So when species are caught and identified, we take swabs or bits of tissue, and then we'll sequence those and add them to the local reference database. Actually, the cool thing with that is that you might take samples initially, and find that you can only identify, say, 20% of the fish in the Amazon to species level. But you've captured what's there, right? So you'll just have a lot of species which just says, this is a species within this family. As you build up that reference database, you can go back to your existing data and retrospectively add the new names in. So you don't need to sort of create a whole reference database before you start monitoring. It works best to do them in parallel.
Brilliant. Well, with that, thank you very, very, very much, Kat. Another round of applause for you through our virtual environment that we have here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to pass the baton from Kat all the way across to a little island off Vancouver. So it's not even Vancouver Island. It's a very small island somewhere off Vancouver. And hopefully we will have Craig somewhere on the line. I know that Craig's internet has been a little bit dodgy. So if that is still the case, don't worry. We will go to a slightly different session. So Craig, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you, sir. This is amazing. How are you doing?
Good. I'm doing very well.
Brilliant. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we come into our final very fast session at the end of the day, we've got Craig Rice on the phone. Now, Craig is an expert when it comes to all things projects. So he's an expert at making all of the projects work. I know that Craig has only recently joined us in our session today. So Craig, before we set you off on your spiel, just to let you know that there's been an awful lot of discussion around how do we truly make our raw materials, the full value chain, responsible. So it's all about responsibility as a whole. And I think what would be great to hear from yourself is what are some of the tools and techniques perhaps that we might use to not only make sure that a project such as a mining project is successful, but successful in the long term. So for example, we don't go and damage the reputation, for example, of an area, and what might some of those shortcomings be with regards to project management as a whole. So Craig, over to your wonderful self.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. So I'll just give a brief introduction myself, my work, who I am, and kind of how I ended up speaking to you here. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm the west coast of Canada. I am on Vancouver Island. I live in a small community with, let's say internet here could be better, especially given that now everybody is working from home. It's taxing the system, but hopefully I'm able to stay online for the entire duration of the presentation. So a little bit about me, by training, I'm a mechanical engineer. I've worked in mining for the last 15 years and have worked pretty much exclusively in project development. In the project development side, I've worked a lot on construction, both at site and then in planning projects at companies' home offices. So there's a professional side of what I do, which is working with clients, helping develop these mining projects. And then a research side. I'm a PhD candidate at University of British Columbia and the Keevil Institute of Mining Engineering. And my research there is focused really on project risk management and how you can tie effective risk analysis and decision analysis into mining project development. Before I get into my research just a little bit, I'll, I guess, give just a very short brief on project risk management. And if you're familiar with common concepts in risk management and enterprise risk management, when they started applying these tools to projects, what they really just did is put the word project in front and really didn't think too much about how to adapt the tools into a project setting. And what makes a project setting a little bit different is that projects are temporary by nature. And by that, I mean the initiative of building the project is temporary. The project itself is obviously, the asset you're building is obviously more permanent, but project is a temporary or time-bound endeavor. You're meant to fulfill a specific objective, building an asset. And it really comes down to what is called, or how effectively or successfully you build that comes down to what they call the triple constraint or the iron triangle of project management, which is managing effectively your scope, your cost, and your schedule. Risk management within, project risk management tends to focus very much on project execution risk. So risks related to the project activities not occurring or not happening as originally planned. One of the things that I first noticed when working in this area is that it's a really tunneled and myopic view of risk management. Just saying is, are contractors going to deliver on time? Are the vendors going to give us equipment on time? and not looking much more broadly at the mining company as a whole, and not just the mining company, but also all the stakeholders, communities, and different actors or agents that that can be impacted by developing a mining project. So my views on project risk management, I won't say they're revolutionary by any means, but they're certainly looking to build on the tools that we currently have. So instead of just seeing it as a small function that's within a project that tries to stop bad things from happening, that it really is a layer that works together with all the other project functions and the internal clients and external stakeholders to that mining company to improve project success and overall asset success and overall company success. So then just a bit, I guess, to talk about what I...
And just while we wait for the Wi-Fi signal from Vancouver to come back, just in terms of the project risk management that Craig is referring to at the moment, whilst I try and fill this, and then I'll be overwritten by the cyborg that I'm sure will reappear. With regards to the project risk management that Craig carries out, he's really taking an enterprise-wide approach to be able to stitch all those different aspects together. Craig, as soon as you can hear me, just wave at me. And so what this is allowing us to do with regards to the project risk management is then bring in some of those different facets that we've been discussing through the course of today. So be it on the geological aspect, be it on the different streams of the social or the environmental facets that we really need to be able to bring together as a whole. Now, just while we're waiting for Craig to try and come back and join us online, I'm actually just going to reach out to some of our other panelists that we have online. So panelists, if you are still there, can you please come off or turn on your videos so that we can see you. And then what we will be able to do is I can wave at you and maybe bring you in on the conversation as a whole. So Dan, I'm going to come back to you because you raised your eyebrows at me first, and just say, having sat here through the whole course of the day and having spoken first, is there a particular aspect or idea or challenge or problem, for example, that has really smacked you around the face and made you go, aha, or did you know it already? Over to you, Dan.
No, I wouldn't. No, by no means did I know it all already. I think there's been some really interesting talks. I think what we're getting from this afternoon session and across all the talks, across all the sessions is actually there's a lot of different threads that we've got to try and pull together to understand sustainability in mining and how we might improve it and how we might factor it into resource responsibility. One of the things that is striking me though, and it's everything from what Frederick spoke about in terms of measuring outcomes and impacts rather than inputs and outputs. It's, perhaps what I talked about with byproducts, it cross-cuts how we deal with resource reporting, particularly when we're perhaps talking about inventories and stocks rather than reserves and resources in the strictest sense, and we want to be a bit looser with our terminology. It affects business practices and how you might manage interactions with artisanal and small-scale miners. What really we need is external verification of these factors, and I'm seeing a lot of tools coming through and methods for the mining industry to take ownership of some of it themselves. What I'm not really seeing is ways that they can prove that they're doing the right thing rather than showing it themselves. And I think that is what ultimately people are going to want, because there is a risk that you just look like you're patting yourself on the back and that you've got a really good business model. So I guess, how do we capture a lot of these different aspects and make it into something that people can trust?
Yeah, so we're coming back to that word trust yet again, and that's certainly something that was coming through in spades this morning and yesterday. And yeah, where do we get that verification that is perhaps independent of the people who are actually doing the activity themselves. So, I mean, for example, you've got brilliant data collection mechanisms such as those which Kat just described, and through the week we will hear from some more organisations similar to Kat who are collecting data by different ways that are independent of the people who are perhaps causing some of that data, shall we say, in a way. But Victor, if I can come to yourself, because this is something here where I think you very much touched on this during your talk, and between yourself and Tom, you certainly sparked a huge amount of conversation over the Q&A. So is there anything you would like to add into this final summary for today's afternoon session?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'd like to pick up on Dan's comment about systems and how can we improve the trust on those systems. I believe we have something in place that can be useful as a template, and this is the competent person approach that many reporting standards have. So all the competent person approach relies on the trust that we can have on the individual that is signing the report. And this has been in place since the 90s. I mean, the Crisco family of reporting standards, and it was developed basically to fight fraud. So the system is in place, it gets the confidence of investors, and it relies on that person that is signing the report, because after signing it, it will become liable, both civil and responsible liable, and this might have the impact to prevent more frauds and in fact reinforces the system as a whole. So that exists, that can be used. And of course, I believe that's only a part of the problem, because as I was defending in my presentation, we also need to bring the consumers into the conversation. And this is a problem that the mining industry has, because there is a reputation issue. No industry likes to be associated to mining, and many people does not understand that the gadgets that they are using raw materials that are coming from a mine. So we still have a lot to do on that. Thank you.
We certainly do. And I think, as we're seeing coming through on chat from Ludovine, so this role of the competent person, or the people who are having to make decisions, is becoming more and more complex as a whole. And so, I mean, maybe Tom, I mean, your talk obviously touched on this as well. Have you got anything to add to what Victor was saying? And then we'll come across to Jane from your insight from that compliance side.
Yeah, unfortunately, my computer completely crashed after my talk, so I missed Victor's talk completely. So I missed some of this discussion. But yeah, in terms of the sort of the competent person side of things and how we use that to kind of quantify resources, you know, I think it's and there's lots of chat about this, and lots of I was pulled up on a few technical aspects. But I think basically I was talking about the UNFC, and at the moment, I don't think there's not a requirement in the UNSC for this competent person approach. There is discussion, I think, whether there should be or not, and how that will work. But I think this sort of harks back to the fact that the way we define resources is going to be dependent on kind of what we want to get out of it. Whether we're going to we're talking to policy people, whether we're talking to industry people, because we're kind of the data needs are completely different. So perhaps when we talk about the competent person with regard to UNFC or regard to the kind of national inventories of stocks I was talking about, we might be talking about kind of doing it on an organizational level, because obviously National Geological Survey, most will not have a regulatory role, they will not have the expertise and staff in place to kind of do this competent person assessments, and certainly not the resources to kind of go out and get that done. So we kind of need to think about how are we going to sort of get that level of confidence in these kinds of measures of national inventories and stocks, and that those discussions I think are ongoing. Whether that's done via a sort of European group or at an organisational level, I'm not sure, but it's certainly I think a really important question to ask.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Tom. And don't worry, you will be able to watch Victor's wonderful presentation online, as we keep saying. So no, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Jane, across to yourself for some final words of wisdom, and then we'll go to Kat.
I'm just tacking on to the conversation about competent person. I do agree that that is a way. I think things. And environmental and social governance, we need to look at sites specifically. Each project in operation is unique in its unique setting. And I think a competent person can play an important role in that. I think with mineral resource and ore reserve reporting, the competent person is often just the geologist, and some geologists have a very, very good understanding of the importance of environmental and social governance modifying factors, and others don't. There are plenty of reports on resources and reserves that really neglect the environmental and social governance. I think the new Crisco template that's come out is fantastic in that it pays more attention to ESG modifying factors when declaring resources. It's not, you don't have to just do it for reserves, you have to consider it better, but it's not being applied yet.
Yeah, no, I think as we've seen here today, there's an awful lot of work that is going on at the moment. And I know that there are a number of committees, for example, that are looking at how can we ramp up on that competent person's understanding, but also as well, how do we make it practical and useful for the people who actually need to make these decisions? So something like biodiversity, which is a massive subject, actually making use of technology such as that which Kat described to us just now, does that actually make some of those decisions a bit easier? Because it's actually easier to get a much better and higher quality data set. So with that elegant segue, Kat, across to yourself for your final comments.
Thanks. I don't know that I have a huge amount to add, but I think one of the things that has sort of struck me going through the process that we've gone through is that these sorts of, one of the things that these sorts of communities can do probably is to look at how we can evaluate and adopt new tools and technology that are coming in that can help to solve some of these problems. There's so much sort of reliance on what's been done before or what happens to be written into the guidelines or standards or whatever, which is just based on what people knew about at the time. So, how do you bring new tools to the table and make sure they're good enough, make sure they're giving you the information that you need, but at the same time sort of bring them to a point where they can be adopted and actually deliver the potential to improve the status quo as fast as possible, because we don't have a huge amount of time to make the big changes in environmental governance. So yeah, that would be my thought.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Kat. And just as we go across to Sarah, who is very close to Craig, who is now back with us, so thanks to the internet of Vancouver Island. But Sarah, as just we come through to you just to highlight the fact that, as Victor very kindly says, the CP or the competent person may actually be a team of people. So you're actually pulling together those different levels of expertise that you need there. But Sarah, across to yourself for your final thoughts.
Thanks. So yeah, I think lots of interesting comments. I would just maybe wrap up by going a bit more macro level and just sort of stepping back and thinking there's so much opportunity here for our industry to sort of reposition and reimagine what we do and how we do it. Yeah, and I think that really requires geologists more now than ever to be able to sort of bridge all these different pieces of the puzzle as such. So let's look to where we can align with government objectives. Let's look to where we can add more value in communities, and let's look how we can better integrate through the supply chain and also tell our stories better to communities and consumers. I think that's all really important. So yeah, thanks.
Brilliant. I think that is a really lovely note to end on. So how do we tell our stories better and also learn from one another as well? So this is something where I know that Craig is back with us now. Craig is a risk manager. I am a risk manager. As you saw, we had a backup there for when his internet died a death. These things happen when you're attempting to do something online and live, but have no fear. We will be able to capture some of that wisdom from Craig's head and be able to bring it into the conference later. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 6 o'clock here in the UK, which means it is the end of the second session here on Tuesday, the 12th of May. We will be reconvening early tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Is that correct, Rose? 8 a.m. UK time for session number 4. of our conference. So we're not halfway yet, Rose, we're not halfway, we're getting there. And I think there's some really, really lovely themes and also information that are coming through throughout the course of this conference. So thank you so, so much to all of our wonderful speakers who turned up and shared those 10, 20 minutes of their lives with us, including, of course, Craig's 30 seconds of fame. But thank you very, very much. And please feel free to dial in again for your free spot in tomorrow's conference. Thank you very much. Good night. Bye.